The cough woke me before my eyes opened, not a polite cough, the kind that drags up something wet and wrong from deep in your chest and leaves your ribs aching like you lost a fight. I lay there on cold stone, staring at a sky the color of dirty dishwater, and tried to remember who I was. The answer came in two layers. The first layer said I was Jin, a 17-year-old orphan with a debt I couldn't pay, and a body that felt like it had been wrung out and left to dry in the gutter. The second layer, the one sitting quietly behind my eyes like a passenger watching through a window, remembered a different life entirely. A kitchen, stainless steel counters, the smell of a flat-top grill at full heat. I sat up slowly. My arms shook with the effort. The alley around me was the kind of place a city produces when it stops caring. Broken crates stacked against a crumbling wall, puddles of something that was not water, a smell layered so thick you could almost see it. And next to me, listing slightly to the left like a drunk trying to look sober, was my cart. My cart. My inheritance. My empire, apparently. One wheel was cracked. The wood on the side panel had a split running from top to bottom that someone had tried to fix with rope and given up on halfway. The iron surface on top was pitted and stained with rust the color of old blood. I checked my pockets out of habit. The reflex of a man who once kept his phone and wallet on him at all times. What I found instead was a folded piece of paper, stiff with handling. I already knew what it said. The body remembered the sick weight of it even before I unfolded it. Debt owed to Mordos of the copper scale, 47 silver marks. First collection due by sunset of the third day of the harvest month. Failure to make that collection would let Mordos seize my property and indenture my body for a period not less than 7 years. I looked up at the sky. The sun was already climbing. Today was the third day of the harvest month. The full debt was 47 silver marks. I looked at my palm. There were 3 copper coins in it. 3? I had counted them twice already without realizing it. The way you count something hoping the number will change. It didn't change. 47 silver marks. A copper coin was worth 1/20th of a silver. 3 coppers would not impress Mordos. 3 coppers would not impress anyone. 3 coppers would buy me a bowl of thin soup and a hard roll and leave me exactly where I was, except fed. I stood up. My knees tried to argue. I told them we didn't have time for that. The market was already moving 2 streets over. I could hear it before I could see it. The grind of cartwheels on stone, vendors calling out prices, the specific sharp smell of a city feeding itself in the morning. I grabbed the handle of my cart and pushed. The cracked wheel made a sound like a small animal being stepped on. Every third rotation it caught and dragged. I pushed anyway. I had one thing that nobody in this city had. Not a weapon, not a title, not a coin to my name. What I had was a second set of memories sitting behind my eyes, and those memories knew exactly what a flat-top grill could do to a cheap cut of meat if you pressed it hard enough. The back alleys of the market were where the day's waste collected before it was hauled off. Every butcher, every baker, every produce stall generated it. Trimmings, scraps, the pieces that weren't worth the counter space to display. I had grown up, in my other life, learning that the difference between a cheap kitchen and a good one was not the ingredients. It was knowing what to do with the parts everyone else threw away. I stopped at the first pile behind the butcher's row. The butcher himself was a wide man with forearms like fence posts and an expression that suggested he had never once found anything funny. He was breaking down a carcass with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. On the ground behind his stall, in a wooden crate already drawing flies, were the offcuts, the jaw meat, the neck scraps, the fatty connective tissue that took too long to cook properly for a sit-down meal. Tough, fatty, full of flavor, exactly what I needed. I crouched down and reached for the crate. Oi. The butcher didn't even look up from his work. That's refuse. You want refuse? You wait until the pile collectors come. I'll give you 1 copper for the lot, I said. That made him look up because even refuse had a hierarchy in a market like this. He looked at me the way you look at something that has said something so unexpected you need a moment to confirm you heard it correctly. 1 copper, he repeated. It's refuse, I said. You told me so yourself. He stared at me for another moment. Then he shrugged and went back to his work. Take it. I took it. The baker 2 stalls down had yesterday's bread stacked in a basket outside. Not moldy, just old, hard enough to use as a weapon if the situation called for it. She sold me the whole basket for 1 copper and looked at me with the specific pity reserved for people who buy day-old bread at dawn. The vegetable seller at the end of the row had a crate of cabbage and onions that had gone past their best. Still firm, just sharp, acidic. The kind of flavor that makes your face do something involuntary. Free, she said, and gestured at the crate without looking at me. I was going to compost it. I took the cabbage. I took the onions. I found a wedge of hard cheese someone had dropped near the drainage gutter, still wrapped in cloth, barely touched. I picked it up, checked it, and put it in the bag. I had 1 copper left. I looked at my cart. I looked at the rusted iron surface on top of it. In my other life, I had worked a flat-top grill for 3 years during university. A flat top is just a hot metal surface. You get it hot enough, add fat, and the Maillard reaction does the rest. Proteins break down at the surface, sugars caramelize, and the crust that forms locks in everything underneath. The people in this city had never heard of the Maillard reaction. They didn't need to. What they knew was that food either smelled good or it didn't. Either it made you want to stop walking or it didn't. I was going to make them stop walking. I built a small fire under the iron surface using wood scraps from the broken crates in the alley. It took longer than I wanted. My hands were shaking, partly from cold and partly from hunger, and the smoke kept blowing back into my face. But the iron started to heat. I could feel it when I held my palm an inch above the surface. I took the meat scraps and I chopped them. Not fine, not coarse, just enough to break the fibers and let the fat distribute. I packed the mixture into rough balls the size of my fist, pressing hard. Then I put the first ball on the hot iron and I smashed it flat with the bottom of the old pan I had found under the cart. The sound it made was immediate and violent. A sharp hiss, then a sustained sizzle that rose in pitch as the fat rendered and the surface made contact with the metal. The smell hit the air like a fist. I am not exaggerating. I watched it happen. A man 20 feet away, a dock worker carrying a crate of something heavy on his shoulder, physically slowed down. His head turned before the rest of him did, the body responding to something the brain hadn't processed yet. Caramelized fat, rendered meat, salt from the cheap scraps. The smell of the Maillard reaction is not subtle. It is one of the oldest signals the human brain carries. It means food, it means cooked protein, it means eat. I pressed the meat flat against the iron until the bottom crust was dark brown and firm. I flipped it. I laid a thin slice of the hard cheese on top and watched it begin to soften in the rising heat. I cut the hard bread into rounds. I sliced the sharp cabbage and the onions thin and let them sit in the residual heat from the iron's edge, just enough to take the raw edge off. Then I put it together. Bread on the bottom, meat patty with the melted cheese on top, cabbage and onion over that, a smear of the rendered fat from the pan mixed with the caramelized bits scraped from the surface. It looked wrong by this world's standards. Nothing like the thick stews and roasted joints and bread trenchers that filled the market stalls. Too flat, too compact, too fast. The dock worker had put down his crate. He was standing 3 feet from my cart, staring at the thing in my hand with an expression I recognized. Hunger making decisions before the brain catches up. How much? He said. It wasn't really a question. 2 copper, I said. He made a face. 2 copper was not nothing for a dock worker. It was half a morning's casual labor. It's scraps, he said. It's hot, I said, and it smells like that. He looked at it. He looked at me. He reached into his belt pouch and put 2 copper coins on the edge of my cart. I handed it to him. He bit into it and stopped moving entirely. I watched his face. The crust cracked under his teeth. The fat and the acid from the cabbage and the salt from the meat all hit at the same time. His jaw slowed down. His eyes went slightly unfocused. He chewed. He swallowed. He looked at the remaining half in his hand. What is this? He said. Food, I said. He looked at me. He looked at the half-eaten thing in his hand. He finished it in 2 more bites, chewing slowly and deliberately, the way you eat something when you're trying to understand it. Then he said, I'll take another. I was already pressing the second ball flat on the iron. The smell was doing its work. The first transaction had taken 90 seconds. By the time the dock worker was halfway through his second, there were 4 more people standing near my cart. Not a crowd, not a line, just people who had been walking past and found that their feet had stopped cooperating. A pair of city guards in dented armor, a young apprentice with ink-stained fingers who looked like he hadn't eaten since yesterday, a woman with a basket of laundry balanced on her hip who had come to look and was now visibly deciding whether to stay. I kept my hands moving. Press, sear, flip, cheese, bread, assemble. Press, sear, flip, cheese, bread, assemble. The guards were the ones who made it a real line. When 2 men in city colors stop and eat something in public, it becomes visible. Other people see it and recalibrate. If the guards are eating it, it's probably not poison. If the guards are eating it with that expression, it might be worth 2 copper. The line formed the way lines always form. 1 person, then 2, then the critical mass where joining the line feels like the obvious thing to do. The apprentice with the ink-stained fingers bit into his and made a sound that was almost embarrassing. One of the guards elbowed the other and pointed at his own, as if to say, "Do you taste that?" I heard one of them say quietly to his partner, "He's using some kind of herb magic." I looked up. "No magic," I said, "just heat and pressure." The guard looked skeptical. He looked at his food. He took another bite and decided it didn't matter. My hands were aching. The smoke from the fire was making my eyes water. My back hurt from bending over the low iron surface, and the cough was still sitting in my chest, waiting for a moment of weakness to announce itself again. But the coins were accumulating on the edge of the cart. I had stopped counting. I just kept moving. Press, sear, flip, cheese, bread, assemble, hand it over, take the copper, move to the next. I was 3/4 through my meat scraps when I heard a voice I didn't recognize, but the body did. The reaction was immediate and physical. My shoulders tightened, my stomach dropped 2 inches. Well, the word was delivered with the specific satisfaction of someone who expected to find a failure and is now deciding how to process something more complicated. I looked up. He was a thin man, not tall, but the kind of thin that looks deliberate, like he had arranged himself to take up as little space as possible while still being impossible to ignore. He wore a gray coat with brass buttons and carried a small ledger under one arm. His eyes were the color of old coins, and they were currently moving between my cart, my line, and my face with the careful attention of someone doing arithmetic. Mordos's man. The body knew him without needing to be told. Grevin, the collector. He had come for the first collection on a 47 silver debt and found a line of 8 people waiting for smashed meat on bread. The line shuffled. Someone coughed. I kept my hands moving, pressing the next patty flat, not because I was calm, but because stopping would have been worse. "You were supposed to be in the canal by now," Grevin said, almost conversationally. Mordos had a bet. "Tell him he lost," I said. Grevin's expression didn't change. He opened his ledger. He looked at the coins on the edge of my cart. He looked at the line. "You have a collection due by sunset," he said. "I know. You have approximately," he glanced at the coins, "9 copper. I know that too." He closed his ledger. He picked up the 9 copper coins from the edge of my cart, counted them with the practiced speed of a man who counts coins the way other men breathe, and dropped them into his coat pocket. "Progress," he said, without any warmth at all. "Mordos will be pleased to hear you've begun." He turned and walked away through the market crowd, his gray coat disappearing between stalls. I watched him go. The line was still there, 7 people, shuffling forward, waiting for the next one off the iron. The dock worker had come back for a third. One of the guards was asking his partner if they should come back at midday. I turned back to the cart. 9 copper gone. The debt was still 47 silver. The sun was still climbing. The cracked wheel on my cart was still making that sound, but the iron was still hot. I had meat left. I had bread left. And I had just watched 8 strangers pay money for something I made from refuse and heat. I pressed the next ball flat against the iron and listened to it sear. The body was exhausted. My hands were burned in 2 places from the hot metal, and my back felt like someone had been using it for storage. The cough was still there, patient and waiting. None of that was the important thing. The important thing was what I had just seen. Not the coins, not the line, the dock worker's face when he bit into the second one. He didn't buy it because he was hungry. He was hungry when he bought the first one. He bought the second one because he wanted it. Because the combination of fat and acid and salt and crust had done something to his brain that simple hunger doesn't do. That was repeatable, not just repeatable, scalable. If I could do this with 1 iron surface and refuse great ingredients, what happened when I had 2 surfaces? 3? What happened when I wasn't doing every step myself? What happened when the line was 20 people instead of 8? I scraped the caramelized bits from the iron surface and mixed them back into the fat. 1 cart was a day's survival. A system was something else entirely. I needed faster hands. I needed more iron. I needed someone who could work the fire while I assembled. I needed to stop being the only point of failure in a process that was already working. The sun was a third of the way across the sky. I had to earn enough before it set to keep Mordos from closing his hand around my throat. I pressed the next patty flat and watched the crust form. The queue was longer than yesterday. That should have felt good. It didn't. It felt like a rope tightening around my throat. I counted 14 people before I even lit the iron. By the time the first patty hit the surface, there were 22. I flipped too fast and the crust tore. I slowed down and someone at the back of the line groaned loud enough for me to hear it over the sizzle. The problem wasn't the food. The food was right. The problem was that I had 2 hands and 1 iron and a line that kept growing while I stood there being the only thing between raw meat and a finished plate. I dropped the spatula. Not dramatically. It just slipped off the edge of the cart and hit the cobblestone with a flat clank, and I had to bend down and pick it up while 3 people watched me do it. My fingers were shaking, not from fear, from the grip. I'd been holding that handle for hours, and my hands weren't built for this yet. I pressed the next patty down and watched the fat run and thought very clearly, I am the bottleneck. I am the single point where everything slows down and breaks. A man near the front said he'd been waiting long enough and left. I watched him go. I couldn't chase him. I couldn't even call after him without burning what was already on the iron. Two more people drifted away from the back of the line while I assembled the next order. They didn't make a scene. They just decided their time was worth more than my food, and they walked. That was the part that stung. Not the anger, the quiet departure. I could handle someone yelling. Yelling meant they still wanted something from me. The quiet ones had already made their decision, and I had no argument against it. I handed a finished bun to the next man in line, and he took it without looking at me. The iron needed wiping. The onions were running low. I had no one watching the money. I was cooking, assembling, collecting coin, answering questions, and managing the line all at once, and I was doing all of it badly because no single person can do 5 jobs at the same time and do any of them well. I knew this. I had always known this. In the other life, the one sitting behind my eyes, the first rule of any kitchen worth running was simple. One person, one station. I didn't have stations. I had a cart and a problem. I flipped the next patty and felt the heat from the iron climb up my arm and settle in my shoulder like a hot stone. My body was still wrong, still thin, still slow to recover, still the kind of frame that apologized for existing. I could push through it for a while, but pushing through it was costing me time I wasn't getting back. The line shifted. Someone near the middle stepped out, looked at the length of it, and stepped back in, clearly deciding the wait was worth it but not looking happy about the math. I needed to make the math better. I needed hands. I was turning that thought over when I noticed the girl. She was maybe 13, maybe a hard-lived 15. Thin the way I was thin, but faster. She moved through the edge of the crowd the way water moves through a crack, not pushing, just finding the space that was already there. Her eyes were on a merchant 2 spots back in the line. Heavy man, distracted, coin pouch hanging loose off his belt like an afterthought. She was good. Her angle was right. Her timing was patient. If I hadn't spent the last 2 days watching this exact stretch of street for every variable that could hurt my cart, I would have missed her entirely. I didn't miss her. I watched her fingers find the pouch. I watched the cord go slack. I watched her start to pull away. I called out before I even knew her name. You. She froze for exactly 1 breath, which told me everything I needed to know about how often she had been caught. Then she ran. She was fast. Faster than I expected. Faster than anyone that underfed had a right to be. She cut left between 2 barrels and I lost her for a second, and then I saw her again because she'd made the mistake of doubling back toward the cart. Habit? She'd been watching the cart long enough that running toward it felt like running toward safety. I held up the hot bun. She stopped. Not because of me, because of the smell. The fat and the bread and the onion coming off the iron, and she hadn't eaten yet today. I could see it in the way her eyes moved to the food before they moved to me. I said, I'm not calling the guard. She didn't move. I said, the pouch is still in your hand. Put it on the cart and I'll pretend I didn't see the rest. She looked at the pouch. She looked at the bun. She set the pouch on the corner of the cart with the careful precision of someone who had learned very young that fast movements around authority ended badly. I slid the bun toward her. She picked it up and bit into it before I finished the gesture, which told me the hunger was real and not a performance. I let her eat. I turned back to the iron. I pressed the next patty and let the silence do its work. After a moment I said, how long have you been watching this cart? She chewed. She said, 3 days. You counted the money I took in yesterday. A pause. Then, roughly. How roughly? She named a number. It was close. Closer than I would have expected from someone who had been watching from a distance through a moving crowd. I looked at her properly then. Quick hands, sharp eyes, a working memory for numbers, and enough patience to watch something for 3 days before acting. I said, I have a job. It pays in food and a cut of the day's take. She looked at me like I'd said something in a language she didn't quite trust. I said, you stand here, take the coin, count it, and tell me when someone tries to shortchange me or when the line gets ugly. You don't touch anything else, she said. Why would you trust me? I just tried to rob you. I said, because you gave the pouch back when it cost you nothing to run, and because you've watched my cart for 3 days without touching it. I turned back to the iron. That's not a thief. That's someone who does the math first. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the price is too low. I said, what? She said, people are paying it too easily. When something is priced right, people think before they hand over the coin. Your customers don't think, they just pay. That means you're leaving money on the table. I looked at her and realized she had been counting more than coins. She looked back at me with the flat expression of someone stating an obvious fact to someone slightly slower than herself. I said, if I raise the price, I lose the workers. The workers are the line. The line is why the merchants and the guards stop here. If I lose the workers, I lose everyone else. She thought about that. So the cheap price is the bait. The cheap price is the product, I said. The volume is the profit. She chewed the last of the bun, wiped her hands, walked around the cart, and stood next to the coin box. Next, she held out her hand. He put his coin in it. She dropped it in the box, took the assembled bun from me without being asked, handed it to him, and looked at the next person in line before he'd even stepped away. The queue moved. I turned back to the iron and felt something in my shoulders release that I had not even noticed was tight until then. By mid-morning, she had reorganized the line into a single file without being asked. She separated those who knew their order from those still deciding, then told two arguing men to pick something or leave. They picked something. I asked her name while I pressed a patty flat. She said, Fox. Then, after a pause, that is what people call me. I said, why? She said, because I find things. I filed that away and kept cooking. The next problem arrived around noon in the form of a boy, maybe 10, who kept circling the cart with an empty bucket and a hopeful expression. I'd seen him twice already. On the third pass, I asked what he wanted. He said he carried water for the dyer's district and he was fast. I said I needed water for the iron and for rinsing, and if he kept the bucket full, I'd feed him at the end of the day. He said he'd do it for half a bun now and half at the end. I said that was a reasonable negotiation and handed him half a bun. He was back with a full bucket in less time than I expected. The fourth station appeared 10 feet from the cart. An older man sat on an upturned crate, watching the work with the focused attention of someone who used to do something with his hands and missed it. One leg was bent wrong at the knee, the kind of old break that healed badly and never let him stand for long. I asked if he could use a knife. He looked at me. I said I needed the onions cut thin and the bread scored before assembly, and I needed it done sitting down, which was the only position I had available. He said he'd been a carter before the leg. He said his hands still worked fine. I gave him the knife and the cutting board, and he set up on his crate and started working through the onions with the clean, even strokes of someone who had spent years doing repetitive work with their hands and never lost the rhythm. By early afternoon, I had 4 stations. I cooked. Fox took coin and managed the line. The boy kept the water and ran small errands. The old carter handled prep, sitting on his crate with the board across his knees, working steadily through whatever I put in front of him. The queue moved faster than it ever had, not because any one of us was doing something remarkable, because each of us was doing one thing and only one thing, and the thing we were doing fed directly into the next step without anyone having to wait for a single pair of hands to finish 5 jobs in sequence. I watched a finished bun move from prep to iron to assembly to Fox's hand to a customer in the time it used to take me just to flip a patty and reach for the bread. The line didn't shrink. It grew, but it moved now, and a moving line feels different than a standing one. People will wait longer if they can see progress. Fox noticed it too. She said without looking up from the coin box, the line is faster but it looks longer. New people keep joining because they can see it moving. I said that's the point. She said you planned that? I said, I planned for the food to be good and the wait to feel short. The rest follows. She made a sound that might have been skeptical and might have been impressed and was probably both. The old carter handed up a fresh stack of scored bread without being asked, timed perfectly to when I was running low, and I realized he'd been watching my pace and adjusting his own to match it. I hadn't told him to do that. He'd just done it because he understood work. I made a note to learn the old carter's name. The trouble arrived in the middle of the afternoon rush, which was either bad timing or deliberate, and I suspected deliberate. There were 3 of them, not large men, but dressed with the specific kind of care that said they represented something larger than themselves. Heavy guild pins on their coats, the kind worn visibly so you'd know before they said a word what kind of conversation you were about to have. The one in front was soft around the middle in the way of men who eat well and sit often. He had the expression of someone who had delivered bad news many times and had long since stopped feeling anything about it. He stopped in front of the cart and looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already decided to remove. He said, unlicensed street vendor, I kept cooking. He said the Tradesmen's Guild of Hospitality and Provisioning has jurisdiction over all food preparation and sale within the city walls. You are operating without a guild charter, without a premises license, and without the approval of the district warden. I flipped a patty. This cart will cease operation immediately. Fox had gone very still next to me, not afraid. watching, calculating. I said, "What does a guild charter cost?" He blinked. That wasn't the response he'd prepared for. That is not the point. The point is that you are currently in violation of, I said, I understand the violation. I'm asking what it costs to resolve it. Everything has a price. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man whose script had been taken away. Then his expression settled back into its official shape. The cost is irrelevant. You are not eligible for a charter. Charters require a fixed premises, a guild sponsor, and a minimum 5-year residency in the city. I said, so the rules are designed so that someone like me can never qualify. He said the rules exist to maintain standards. I said, whose standards? He didn't answer that. He turned to the two men behind him and gave a small nod. They moved toward the cart. The queue reacted before I did. Not with words, at first, with the simple physical fact of people who had been waiting for their food and were not interested in having that interrupted. The line shifted, bodies turned. A stout woman near the front said loudly that she hadn't been standing here for 20 minutes to go home hungry. One of the guildmen put his hand on the cart's side rail. A voice from the middle of the line said, "Take your hand off that." It was a guard, off duty, from the look of him, in a plain coat with his guild pin from the city watch still on his collar. He was a regular. I knew his order. 2 buns, extra onion, no sauce. He stepped forward out of the line and stood between the guildmen and the cart with the easy posture of someone who was not angry, yet but was prepared to become angry with very little additional provocation. He said, "This cart feeds half the watch on this street. It feeds the dock workers, the tanners, and the market porters too. It feeds people who don't have time to sit in a tradesman's hall and wait for a watered-down bowl of something hot." The soft guildman said, "This is not your concern." The guard said, "It became my concern when you put your hand on the cart." The line had stopped moving. Everyone was watching. The 2 guildmen looked at each other and then at their leader. The soft man's face had gone through several expressions and had landed on something controlled and careful. He said, "This is not finished." He said it to me, not to the guard. I said, "I know." He straightened his coat. He looked at the cart one more time with the measuring look of someone filing information away for later. Then he turned and walked, and his 2 men followed, and the crowd watched them go with the particular silence of people who have witnessed something and are deciding what it means. The guard turned back to the line and said, "Right. Who's next?" The woman near the front said she was, and held out her coin, and the line started moving again. Fox leaned close to me and said quietly, "They'll be back." I said, "I know?" She said, "With more people, or with a warden's notice, or with someone who can actually shut you down." I said, "Probably all 3 in that order." She said, "You don't seem worried." I pressed the next patty flat against the iron and watched the crust form and thought about a man who had just walked away with a look in his eyes that said he was already planning the next move. I said, "I'm worried, I'm just not surprised." The old carter on the crate handed up a fresh stack of bread without a word. The water boy came back with a full bucket and a slightly proud expression, like he'd run faster than usual and wanted credit for it. Fox took a coin from the next customer, dropped it in the box, and handed back the bun with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years rather than hours. The line kept moving. Somewhere across the market, I was fairly sure, a soft man in a heavy guild coat was sitting down with someone important and explaining that the direct approach had not worked and that something more careful was needed. He was right that it hadn't worked. He was right that something more careful was needed. He was wrong about who needed to be more careful. I had 4 people now. I had a moving line. I had guards who ate at my cart and would notice if someone tried to make that stop. I had a girl who counted money with the instincts of someone who had been surviving on sharp eyes and faster math her whole life, and who had just spent an afternoon learning exactly how my cart ran and what it needed and where the weak points were. I hadn't asked her to do that last part. She'd just done it. Because she was not a thief. She was someone who studied things before she touched them. I was going to need that. The sun was moving west, and the iron was hot, and the queue was long, and the day was not finished. One problem at a time. The morning smelled wrong before I even opened the crate. Not the usual smell of a market waking up. Not fish and smoke and horse sweat and bread. Something underneath all of that. Something sour and close and wrong in a way that made the back of my throat tighten. I'd learned to trust that feeling in another life. The delivery had come early. The butcher's boy had left the crate at the corner of the alley before dawn, the way he always did, wrapped in rough cloth, stamped with the mark I recognized. I crouched down and pulled the cloth back. The color was off, not obviously, not the kind of off that a tired customer would catch from 3 steps away, but enough to make my stomach tighten. But I had stood over flat-top grills in a different world for long enough to know what fresh meat looked like and what it looked like when it had been sitting somewhere warm for too long. I pressed 2 fingers against the surface. The texture gave wrong. I stood up and didn't touch the crate again. The queue was already forming. 6 people, then 8, then 12. Word had moved through the district faster than I had expected. The smell of yesterday's run still lived in the stones around the cart. People came back for that smell, and I was going to turn them away empty. I stepped in front of the cart and held up both hands. The looks I got were not friendly. A dock worker near the front crossed his arms. A woman with a basket on her hip made a sound that meant she had been standing there long enough to have opinions about it. I told them the morning batch was not ready. I told them to come back at midday. I told them the food would be worth the wait. Nobody believed me, but they left. Fox appeared at my shoulder the moment the last person turned the corner. She had that look she got when she already knew something and was deciding how much of it to tell me. She told me she had heard it last night. 2 men near the south gate talking to Pello, the meat supplier's runner. She had not heard the number, but she had heard the word guild. I looked at the crate. I looked at the queue that was no longer there. They had not tried to burn the cart. They had not sent someone to start a fight. They had done something quieter and more patient. They had reached back one step in the chain and touched the thing I depended on before the food even reached my hands. If I had cooked that meat, someone would have gotten sick by evening. By morning, the story would have been all over the district. Not that the guild had paid a supplier to deliver bad stock. The story would have been that the orphan boy's cart made people sick, that the food from the alley was dirty, that the smell was a lie covering something rotten underneath, and I would have had no way to prove otherwise. I stood there for a moment with the empty alley around me and the bad crate at my feet and thought about the shape of what had just happened. They were not trying to beat me in a market. They were trying to make me disappear by making people afraid of me. Fear was the weapon. Trust was the target, which meant trust was the only thing I actually had to protect. I told Fox I needed people, not hired hands, not muscle. People the guild would not bother to watch because the guild had already decided they were worthless. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said she knew where to start looking. The part of the city I followed her into that afternoon was not on any merchant's map. Not because it was hidden, because nobody who drew maps thought it was worth marking. The buildings here were old enough that the walls leaned on each other for support. The streets were more suggestion than fact. The people sitting in doorways and against broken walls were the kind of people a city produces when it chews through someone and then spits out what it cannot use. Fox stopped in front of a man sitting on an overturned barrel outside a crumbling workshop. He was somewhere between 40 and 60, with the kind of face that had once been round and was now just tired. His right sleeve was pinned up at the elbow. He was using his one remaining hand to sharpen a knife with the focused patience of someone who had nothing else to do and had been doing it for a long time. His name was Breck. He had been a line soldier for 11 years. He had lost the arm at a river crossing that nobody remembered anymore. The army had given him a small coin and a letter of thanks and then forgotten he existed. I crouched down to his level and told him I needed someone who could hold a press flat and keep a rhythm under pressure for 4 hours without losing focus. He looked at the pinned sleeve. He looked at me. I told him I was not asking about the arm. I was asking about the 4 hours and the focus. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had managed a shield wall for 3 years. He thought he could manage a piece of iron. I said he started tomorrow. The second person Fox brought me to was harder to find. We went through 2 more streets and a covered passage that smelled like old rope before she stopped in front of a doorway, where an old man was sitting on a low stool with his eyes closed and his face tilted slightly upward. His name was Soren. He had been a spice merchant's taster for most of his adult life. Then his eyes had gone. The merchant had replaced him with someone younger who could read labels and had let Soren go with a week's pay and a recommendation that nobody ever followed up on. Fox told me he could smell the difference between fresh dill and dill that was 2 days past useful from across a room. I crouched down again. I asked Soren to tell me what he smelled on my hands. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, iron from a cart handle, wood smoke from a fire that burned hardwood, not softwood, rendered fat that was clean and not rancid, and underneath all of that, something that had been near spoiled meat recently but had not touched it directly. I looked at Fox. She looked back at me with an expression that said she had already known this was going to work out. I told Soren I needed a nose that could clear every morning delivery before anything touched the iron. I told him I would pay per shift and I would not ask him to stand for more than 2 hours at a time. He said that sounded like the most useful he had been in 4 years. The third person was the one I had been thinking about since the night I first understood that the cart was not going to be enough on its own. Marek was not hard to find. He was hard to approach. He lived in what had once been a small alchemist's workshop at the edge of the craftsman's district, wedged between dye houses and old storage sheds. The workshop had been his until the Alchemists Guild had reviewed his license 3 years ago and decided that his methods were irregular, his results were unpredictable, and his experiments with fermented bark extract and compressed gas were a public hazard. They had revoked his license and fined him more than he had. When we got to the workshop, the door was open. Not because he was welcoming visitors, because the last experiment had taken the upper hinge off and he had not gotten around to fixing it. I stepped inside. The room smelled like burnt sugar, something sharply herbal, and a faint trace of something that made my eyes water slightly before adjusting. Marek was at a long table covered in notes, jars, and 3 ceramic vessels of different sizes, each stained by a different failed experiment. He was a thin man, somewhere in his 50s, with ink on both hands and the look of someone who had stopped caring what other people thought about him at some point in the past and had found the experience liberating. He did not look up. He said he was not buying anything and not selling anything, and if I was from the guild I could leave the way I came. I told him I was not from the guild. He looked up. I told him I had heard he had been experimenting with bitterwood bark extract and carbonated water before the guild pulled his license. He said that was a matter of public record and not something he was ashamed of. I told him I was not here to shame him. I was here because I thought his failed experiment was actually a product, and I wanted to know if he agreed. That got his full attention. I sat down across from him and I talked for a while. I told him about the bark, about the bitter compound in it that woke something up behind the eyes when you tasted it, about the way a sharp, cold, carbonated liquid could carry flavors that a warm drink could not, about the way sweetness and bitterness and cold carbonation together created something that was not quite food and not quite medicine and was more addictive than either. Marek listened with the focused stillness of a man who had been waiting 3 years for someone to say exactly this. He said the carbonation problem was the hard part. He could get the gas into the liquid. Keeping it there under pressure long enough to serve it was where everything had gone wrong. I told him I had some ideas about that. Sealed ceramic, wax stoppers, small batches, serve cold, serve fast. He picked up a jar and looked at it for a long moment. Then he said we should probably start with the sugar. The next 4 days in that workshop were not clean or elegant. The first attempt tasted like burnt medicine and smelled like a wet forest. Marek drank it anyway and made notes. The second attempt was better on the smell and wrong on the sweetness. I had him pull back the bark extract and add a small amount of dried sour berry that I had found at the back of a market stall for almost nothing. The third attempt exploded. Not dangerously. The ceramic vessel cracked at the seal and the contents went across the table and the ceiling and the front of Marek's coat in a brown spray that smelled surprisingly good. Marek stood there dripping and looked at the ceiling. He said that was actually the best it had smelled so far. I told him to write down exactly what he had done before the explosion. The fourth attempt did not explode. It fizzed. It came out dark and cold from the sealed vessel, sharp and sweet and bitter, in a way that moved through the back of the throat and left something that made you want another sip before the first one had finished. I handed it to Marek. He drank it slowly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he had spent 15 years trying to create something that would change the world, and the guild had laughed at him and stripped his license and fined him into poverty. He said he appeared to have done it by accident while making a soft drink. I told him the world got changed by useful things more often than by impressive ones. He did not look entirely comforted by that, but he picked up his pen and started writing anyway. We brought the first sealed batch to the cart on the 5th morning. Breck was already at the press, working the iron with the steady mechanical patience of a man who had learned to do hard things with his body and not complain about it. Soren was at the delivery crate, his face tilted down, working through the morning meat delivery with his nose moving slowly and deliberately across each wrapped portion. He flagged 2 pieces. He set them to the side without a word. I looked at the 2 flagged pieces and thought about what Fox had told me about the guild's runner at the south gate. I kept them, wrapped separately, labeled. The cart opened at the usual time. The new item had no name yet. I had put it in sealed ceramic cups with wax stoppers and set them in a bucket of cold water from the well. When the first customer asked what it was, I told him it was something cold and sharp and that it would make the food taste better and the afternoon feel shorter. He bought one mostly because he was curious. He drank half of it before he had taken 3 steps away from the cart. He turned around and bought another one. By midday, the bucket was empty and Marek was back at the workshop making the next batch, and I had a queue that was running longer than any day since the first week. A group of young men from the Academy district had found their way to the cart by mid-afternoon. One of them called it Liquid Focus. Another said it was better than the stimulant tea they bought from the apothecary for twice the price. A third bought 4 cups and carried them back toward the Academy in a cloth sack, walking fast. The stall 2 rows over, run by a woman who sold spiced wine and had been watching my cart with growing displeasure for 2 weeks, watched the academy students leave and then watched the next group arrive and then watched the group after that. She did not say anything, but she watched. Fox found me near the end of the day as I was wiping down the iron. She said the guild had noticed the new drink. She said there was a conversation happening in one of the guild halls about whether a carbonated beverage fell under the alchemist's charter, or the innkeeper's charter, or possibly neither. I told her that was going to be a long conversation. She said that was what she was counting on. I told her there was something else I needed her to do. I told her about the flagged meat, the 2 pieces Soren had set aside that morning. I told her I needed to know exactly where they had come from in the supply chain. Not just that Pello's runner had delivered them, where they had been before that, who had touched the crate, whether there was a way to trace the decision back to whoever had paid for it. Fox looked at the 2 wrapped pieces I had kept. She said that was going to take a few days. I told her to take whatever she needed. 3 days later, she came back with a name. Not just Pello, not just the runner, a name that connected the supplier's back room to a man who worked as a record keeper for the South Market Guild Hall, who had been seen twice in the past month meeting with someone from the Innkeepers Guild Senior Council. The chain was short and clear and documented. The next morning, I set up the cart in the usual place. I waited until the queue was at its longest, which was the moment when the most people were standing close enough to hear without being obviously gathered for a confrontation. Then I brought out the 2 wrapped pieces and set them on the end of the cart where everyone could see. I unwrapped them slowly. I called Soren over and asked him, in a voice that was not loud but was not quiet, to tell the people nearest the cart what he smelled. Soren leaned in. He was quiet for 2 seconds. He said, "Meat that had been kept warm for at least 2 days past safe." Traces of something applied to the surface that he thought was meant to cover the smell, and underneath that, the beginning of the kind of rot that would have made anyone who ate it sick by evening. The woman with the basket who had been in my queue the morning I turned everyone away was standing 3 people back. She looked at the meat. She looked at me. I told her that was what had been delivered to my cart the morning I sent everyone home without food. I told her I had kept it because I wanted to be sure before I said anything. I put the name of the record keeper on the table next to the meat. I put the name of the guild hall next to that. I told the people standing there that I was not accusing anyone of anything I could not show them. The dock worker who had crossed his arms at me that first morning was near the back of the queue. He looked at the meat. He looked at the name on the table. He said something to the man next to him that I did not catch, but neither of them left. By the time the morning rush ended, 3 different people had asked me for the name of the record keeper. Not because they planned to do anything official with it, because in a district like this one, information moved faster than any guild notice and lasted longer than any fine. The guild had tried to kill my reputation with fear. I had killed their attack with a smell and 2 wrapped pieces of meat and a name. Marek was at the cart by midday with the next batch of sealed cups. He set them in the cold bucket and stood next to me for a moment watching the queue. He asked me in a tone that was carefully casual whether the drink had a formal name yet. I told him not yet. He said that if the drink was going to be sold under a name, and if that name became known, the man who developed the carbonation, bark ratio, and sealing technique deserved a portion of every cup. I looked at him. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who had thought this argument through very carefully and was ready to have it. I told him we would talk numbers tonight. He said that was acceptable and went back to arranging the cups. Breck was working the press without being asked. Soren was already at the next delivery crate, nose moving. Fox was somewhere in the market, watching faces, reading the room the way she always did. I looked at the queue, I looked at the cart, I looked at the city beyond the end of the alley. The guild had reached into my supply chain and tried to choke me from the inside, and I had found the reach before it landed, built a nose that could catch it at the door, and turned the attempt into a public demonstration of exactly who was trying to make people sick and who was trying to stop them. That was a good day. But I was standing there looking at the city and thinking about the crate, not the bad crate, the whole system the crate came from. Every piece of meat that came to my cart passed through a chain I did not control. Every sack of grain, every bundle of herbs, every jar of rendered fat, all of it moved through markets and runners and suppliers who answered to guild relationships and old contracts and arrangements that had been in place for longer than I had been alive. As long as that was true, the guild did not need to fight me directly. They just needed to reach back one step and touch something I depended on. They would try again. Maybe not meat next time. Maybe grain. Maybe the fuel for the fire. Maybe the ceramic for Marek's sealed cups. I could catch one attack. I could not catch all of them if the whole supply chain was someone else's territory. I needed my own roads, not the city's roads, not the guild's roads. My roads. I found a map that evening. Old, not very accurate, but good enough to show me the main routes that ran out of the city to the south and east, where the farmland was. Where the grain came from, where the cattle grazed, where the small independent farmers worked land that was too far from the city center for the big guild traders to bother with directly. I put my finger on the road that ran southeast toward the river valley. Fox leaned over my shoulder and looked at where my finger was pointing. She said that was a 3-hour walk each way. I told her I was not planning to walk it every day. She asked what I was planning. I told her I was planning to make it so the farmers out there had a reason to come to me first, before the guild traders ever showed up at their gates. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that was either very smart or a significant amount of additional work. I told her it was probably both. The cart was still warm behind us. The queue was gone for the night. The city was settling into its evening sounds, the distant clatter of taverns opening, and carts being wheeled in and dogs starting their nighttime arguments over territory. Marek was cleaning his equipment. Breck was stacking the pressed iron plates with the careful attention of someone who treated every tool like it had cost him something. Soren was sitting on a low stool with his face tilted up, reading the air the way he always did when he was not working, just listening to the world through his nose. I looked at all of them for a moment. A discharged soldier, a blind taster, a disgraced alchemist, a thief who was actually a strategist. The guild had not bothered to watch any of them. That had been a mistake. I rolled up the map. Tomorrow I was going to start building something the guild could not reach with a bribed runner and a bad crate. I was going to build my own roads. The guild's message arrived at dawn, delivered by a boy who wouldn't meet my eyes. He dropped a folded paper on the cart and ran. I read it twice. Short sentences, official seal. The Guild of Butchers, the Guild of Millers, and the Guild of Grain Merchants had agreed collectively to stop selling to me, my workers, or anyone associated with my operation. Effective immediately. I folded the paper and put it in my coat. Fox was watching me from across the cart. She didn't ask. She already knew what it meant. No meat, no flour, no grain, no bread. Without those 3 things, we had nothing to put in front of a customer. I looked at the cart. I looked at the queue already forming down the alley. Workers and guards and dockmen who had come expecting breakfast. I told Fox to start the morning service with what we had left in storage. Then I walked to the edge of the city and kept walking. I had maybe 3 days of inventory. After that, the syndicate stopped. The guilds knew that. They had done the math before they sent the boy. What they hadn't done was walk the roads outside the city walls. I had. Once, when I was looking for cheaper clay for the workshop, I had passed farms and pastures stretching for miles in every direction, and I had seen the prices painted on the roadside stalls, and I had done my own math. The guild was paying farmers almost nothing, buying low from desperate men who had no other buyers, then selling high to everyone in the city who had no other options. That was the whole structure. Control the middle. Own the world. I walked for 2 hours before I found the first farm. The man who answered the gate was built like a wall and looked at me the way a wall looks at everything, without interest. I told him I wanted to buy meat, direct, weekly, at a price he named, not a price I named. He stared at me for a long time. I was 17, thin, and dressed in clothes that had been washed too many times. I did not look like a buyer. I looked like a problem. I crouched down and drew a line in the dirt with my finger. "Here is what the guild pays you now," I said. I wrote a number. He looked at it. "Here is what I will pay," I said. I wrote another number, larger. He looked at that one longer. I kept going. I drew the whole thing in the dirt. How often I needed delivery, how much volume per week, how I would send a cart so he wouldn't have to move anything himself, how I would pay on delivery, not on credit, not at the end of the month, not when the guild decided to settle accounts. The wall of a man crossed his arms. He said the guild would hear about it. I told him yes, they would, and then they would come to him and offer him a better deal to stop selling to me. And he could take that deal if he wanted, but right now, today, I was offering him more than the guild had ever paid him in his life, and the guild wasn't here. He was quiet for a while. Then he called for his son, and his son called for his brother, and the 3 of them stood there looking at my dirt diagram. The son asked how I planned to store the meat once I had it. I told him I was working on that. He looked at me like that was not a satisfying answer. It wasn't, but it was honest. The old man uncrossed his arms and put out his hand. I shook it. By the end of that day, I had walked to 4 farms and 2 cattle pastures. I had drawn the same diagram in the dirt 6 times. 2 of the farmers said no. 1 wanted to wait and see. 3 shook my hand. Fox met me at the city gate when I came back. She looked at the mud on my boots and the state of my coat and said I looked like I had been dragged behind a horse. I told her we had 3 direct suppliers starting next week. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked where we were going to keep the meat. I told her I was working on that. She gave me the same look the farmer's son had given me. I walked back to the workshop and sat down and thought about cold. The problem was simple and brutal. Meat spoils. In summer, you had maybe 2 days. In a warm storage room, less. If I was going to buy in bulk from farms outside the city, I needed somewhere to put it that wasn't going to kill my customers. The first answer was obvious. Ice pits. We dug 3 of them the next morning on the empty lot behind the workshop. Deep holes lined with straw and packed with ice hauled from the river before dawn. Fox organized the hauling. The veteran ran the digging. By midday, we had 3 working cold pits and a team that smelled like river mud. It worked, for about 4 days. The ice melted faster than I expected. The summer heat came down through the straw and through the wood covers and turned our cold pits into warm pits. The meat at the bottom stayed acceptable. The meat at the top edge was something I wouldn't serve to someone I disliked. I stood at the edge of the 3rd pit and looked at the problem. The veteran stood next to me. He said nothing. He had learned that when I stood looking at something without speaking, I was doing arithmetic in my head, and interrupting the arithmetic made things worse. The arithmetic was not going well. To keep the pits cold enough, I needed more ice than I could haul. To haul more ice, I needed more workers. More workers cost money. The money I saved buying direct from farms was disappearing into the ice operation before it ever reached my hands. I was solving the wrong problem. I wasn't trying to make ice cold enough. I was trying to stop heat from getting in. Those are different problems with different answers. I thought about the wine cellars in the Noble Quarter. I had passed them once, making a delivery. Stone walls, thick, underground. The cold stayed because the heat couldn't reach it. And then I thought about the lords who cooled their wine in summer, not with ice, with frost crystals. I had seen one once at a market stall behind glass, priced at a number that made the stall owner nervous just saying it out loud. A piece of pale blue mineral the size of a fist that held cold inside it the way a coal holds heat. Nobles used them to keep their wine chilled at parties. Some of the richer merchant houses used them to preserve medicine. They were not cheap. They were not meant for someone like me. I told Fox to find me the smallest, cheapest, most damaged frost crystal available in the city. She looked at me. I told her to also find me the cheapest empty lot with solid ground within walking distance of the workshop. She kept looking at me. I told her I had a plan. She said that was what I always said before something expensive happened. She found both things within 2 days. The crystal was a cracked half-piece, one end chipped, the cold output uneven and considered useless for noble purposes. The merchant selling it was embarrassed to have it in his inventory. He wanted it gone. I paid for it with the last of the reserve fund and a short-term loan from a moneylender who charged rates that made my teeth hurt. The lot was a strip of flat ground near the edge of the outer market. Hard clay soil, cheap because nobody wanted to build there. I bought a short lease and started building the same afternoon. The structure was not beautiful. Thick timber frame, double walls packed with straw and dried clay between them, a stone floor laid as deep as we could dig it, a heavy roof with another layer of packed clay on top. Small, no windows, one door with a double seal of oiled leather. The veteran ran the construction crew. He had built fortifications in a previous life, and he understood the principle. Keep the outside out. Marek, our alchemist, spent 2 days studying the cracked crystal and mapping where the cold radiated strongest. He built a small stone cradle in the center of the structure that held the crystal at the angle where its output was most consistent. The whole city thought we had lost our minds. I know this because people said so, out loud, while standing in front of us. A group of minor nobles passed the construction site on their way to the market, and one of them stopped and asked a worker what was being built. The worker said it was a cold storage house. The noble asked what was being stored. The worker said meat, and the answer hung there like a joke. The noble looked at the cracked crystal in its stone cradle, visible through the open doorframe, and then looked at his companions, and they all laughed the way people laugh when something is so ridiculous it stops being funny and becomes impressive in its absurdity. One of them called out to me directly. He said that crystal was worth more than everything I owned, and I was using it to keep sausage cold. I told him his wine cost him a fortune every summer and kept him drunk for an evening. My meat fed 200 people a day and kept them working. He thought about that. Then he laughed again and walked away, but the laugh was different the second time. The cold house was finished on the 8th day. We sealed the door and waited. Marek checked the internal temperature at dawn the next morning. He came out of the cold house with his breath making small clouds in the warm summer air, and a look on his face like a man who had just been proven wrong about something he was very confident about. He said it was holding, not just holding. The temperature inside was lower than the deepest ice pit we had dug, and it was stable. The cracked crystal, cupped in its stone cradle inside a well-insulated box, was doing the work of a ton of river ice without melting, without needing replacement, without costing us labor every morning. I bought the first bulk shipment from the farm that afternoon. A full cart, more meat than we had ever handled in a single delivery. We broke it down, packaged it in the method Merrick had worked out, and loaded the cold house to 3/4 capacity. I stood outside the sealed door and did the math again. This time, the math went well. Buying in bulk dropped the cost per unit. Holding the meat longer meant I could buy when prices were low and sell when demand was high. No spoilage meant no waste. No waste meant every coin I spent on product became a coin I recovered at the cart. The guild had cut me off to strangle my supply. Instead, they had forced me to build something they couldn't touch. They controlled the city market. They had no reach past the city walls. Every farm I signed was a supply line they couldn't block. Every week of stable cold storage was a week I didn't need them. The boycott had handed me independence. I don't think they understood that yet. Mordos understood it. He came to see the cold house himself, which surprised me. He was not the kind of man who left his counting room to look at construction projects. He stood outside the sealed door with 2 of his men and looked at the building with the expression of someone adding numbers in his head. He asked how much the crystal had cost. I told him. He asked how much the lot lease cost. I told him. He asked how much the construction cost. I told him. He stood there for a moment, and I watched him calculate the total debt I was carrying, between his loan and the new moneylender and the farm contracts, and I watched him decide that I was overextended and probably about to collapse. He smiled. Not a warm smile, the kind that means someone thinks they are watching you dig your own grave. He reminded me politely that my payment to him was due at the end of the month. I told him I knew. He reminded me less politely what happened to people who missed payments. I told him I knew that too. He left. The end of the month was 12 days away. I ran the numbers every night. The cold house changed everything. With stable storage, I could run the carts at full capacity without worrying about what happened if a delivery was late or a morning was slow. I could prepare more in advance. I could cut waste to almost nothing. Waste had been invisible before. I hadn't tracked it carefully enough. Now I tracked it obsessively. Every piece of meat that went unsold, every batch of bread that went stale, every portion that had to be thrown away was a number I wrote down and stared at. The cold house cut that number by more than half in the first week. The farm contracts cut my ingredient cost by a third compared to what I had been paying the guild suppliers. The combination was violent in the best possible way. By the 10th day after the cold house opened, I had the full amount. Not close to it, not almost. The full amount, plus a margin I kept back as reserve. I counted it twice. Fox counted it once. Marek counted it and then looked uncomfortable because he had expected the number to be wrong. On the morning of the 11th day, I walked to Mordos's counting room. He was behind his desk when I came in. He had the expression he always wore when he saw me, mild contempt, mild curiosity, the look of a man watching a small animal do something unexpectedly complicated. I put the bag on his desk. He looked at it. I told him it was the full amount, principal and interest, every coin. He didn't move for a moment. Then he opened the bag and started counting. He counted slowly. He was thorough. He was the kind of man who had been cheated before and had decided the solution was to count everything twice himself. When he finished, he sat back in his chair. He looked at the money. He looked at me. He said something I didn't expect. He said he had been certain I would fail. I told him most people had been. He said he had planned to take my cart and my workshop and the workshop lease when I defaulted. I told him I knew. He said he had not planned for this. I told him I knew that too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked carefully if I needed any further capital for expansion. I looked at him. He looked at me. I told him I would think about it. I walked out of his counting room with the debt cleared and nothing owed to anyone who had ever looked at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be dealt with. This is the first real turn. Jin did not just pay a debt. He bought back the right to exist without Mordos counting his breaths. The cold house matters because freedom here is not emotion. It is supply. Once your enemy no longer controls your ingredients, your storage, or your deadline, he controls far less than he thinks. The air outside smelled like the market, smoke and bread and animal and stone. I stood on the street for a moment and breathed it. Fox was waiting at the corner. She read my face before I said anything. She said nothing. She just nodded once, the way she nodded when something had gone exactly as planned and she wasn't going to make a scene about it. We walked back toward the workshop together. I was thinking about the next problem. I was always thinking about the next problem. That was the only way this worked. The guild had failed to stop me with the boycott. Mordos had lost his hold on me with the debt. The cold house was running. The farm contracts were running. The carts were running. I had built something the old system couldn't reach, but I had also become visible. That was the part that kept me awake at night. Every time I solved a problem, I became more visible to people with larger problems and larger tools to solve them with. I was thinking about that when we turned the corner onto the main road and I heard them. The sound came first. Boots on stone, hundreds of them, the low rhythmic crash of a marching column moving through a city street. Then the smell, sweat and leather and road dust and something else underneath, something sour and stale that I recognized immediately. Bad food. The smell of people who had been eating badly for weeks. I stopped at the edge of the road and watched the column pass. Royal Infantry, a full regiment by the look of it. They had the king's colors on their shoulders and the look of men who had been walking for a long time and sleeping badly and eating worse. Their faces were gray with road fatigue. Their equipment was worn but maintained. These were professional soldiers, not conscripts. They knew how to carry themselves even when they were exhausted, but the exhaustion was real. I watched the supply carts at the rear of the column. Heavy wagons, slow, loaded with sacks of grain and barrels of something that smelled like it had been salted so heavily it barely qualified as food anymore. Army rations. I had read about them in a different life. Dried hard bread, salt meat, grain porridge, all designed to last months in a wagon, rather than to keep a human body functioning at full capacity. It worked. Technically, men didn't die of starvation on army rations. They just moved slower, thought slower, healed slower, fought worse. An officer near the rear of the column noticed me watching. He was older, heavy around the middle, with the look of a man who had been managing logistics for a long time and had stopped being surprised by anything. He looked at my cart. He looked at the food on it. He looked at his column. He pulled his horse to the side of the road and stopped next to me. He asked what I was selling. I told him. He asked the price. I told him. He looked at the cart again, and then at the column moving past us, and I watched him do a calculation that had nothing to do with the price of a single meal. He asked quietly how much it would cost to feed 100 men. I looked at the column. I looked at the supply wagons. I looked at the officer's face, which was the face of a man who had a problem he didn't know how to solve with the tools he currently had. I told him I could give him a number by morning. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he gave me a name and a location and told me to be there before the first bell. He rode back to his column. I stood on the side of the road and watched the regiment march past, 1,000 tired men eating badly, carrying the king's colors into whatever came next. Fox appeared at my shoulder. She said nothing for a while. Then she asked if I was thinking what she thought I was thinking. I told her I was thinking about how many cold houses I would need to build between here and the Eastern Road. She was quiet again. Then she said we were going to need more crystal. The crystal order went out before dawn. Fox was already moving before I finished the sentence, which meant she had been thinking the same thing I was thinking, which meant we were both watching the same problem grow on the eastern horizon. The army was hungry, not in the way a beggar is hungry, in the way a machine runs dry. I had heard the numbers from 3 different sources over the past week. 2 supply wagons delayed by road mud. 1 full grain shipment spoiled because the contractor stored it in a wet cellar and billed the crown for dry storage anyway. The standard army ration was already short by roughly a third, and the big autumn exercises were 2 weeks out. Nobody in the officer corps was talking about it loudly. That was the tell. When a problem is loud, someone is trying to fix it. When it goes quiet, someone is trying to hide it. I started walking toward the garrison district the next morning, with nothing but a sample box and a clean shirt. The camp was east of the main market, behind a wall of pale stone that smelled like old horses and wet wool. The gate guard looked at me the way guards always look at someone who does not belong. Slow eyes, hand resting on belt, no urgency because I was obviously not a threat. I told him I had a business proposal for the quartermaster. He told me the quartermaster did not meet with street vendors. I told him I was not a street vendor. I was the man who had been feeding half his garrison for the past 3 weeks without permission, and I thought it was time to make that official. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he let me through, which I suspected meant he had eaten one of our burgers himself at some point. The quartermaster's tent smelled like old paper and anxiety. The man behind the table had the face of someone who had been managing a problem by not looking at it directly. He was surrounded by ledgers, and none of them were open. I put the sample box on his table. He did not open it. He told me the army had its own provisioning contracts, established suppliers, and a chain of command that did not include unlicensed food carts. I asked him when the last shipment of fresh meat had arrived on schedule. He did not answer. I asked him how many days the Eastern Barracks had been running on dry grain and salt pork. Still nothing. I opened the box myself. The smell hit the tent before he could object. 2 burgers, wrapped in waxed cloth to hold the heat, and 2 small bottles of the cola, sealed with cork and wax. He looked at the food the way a man looks at something he wants but has decided not to want. I left the box on the table and told him I would come back in the morning. I was halfway to the gate when I heard the cork pop. The next morning I did not go back to the quartermaster. I went to find the general. His name was Aldrich Vane, and he had the kind of reputation that gets built over 30 years of being right in the field and wrong in the capital. He was not a cruel man, he was a proud one, which is a different problem entirely. He was inspecting the eastern yard when I arrived. Rows of soldiers in half armor moving through drills, the sound of boots on packed dirt, officers shouting corrections. He stood with his hands behind his back and watched like a man reading a book he had already memorized. His adjutant intercepted me before I got within 20 paces. I explained who I was. The adjutant told me the general did not meet with food sellers. I told him I understood completely and asked him to simply pass along one number, the cost per soldier per day of the current provisioning contract versus the cost per soldier per day of what I was already delivering to the northern barracks without a contract. The adjutant looked at me like I had said something mildly offensive. Then he walked over to the general and said something quietly. Vane turned and looked at me, not the slow guard look, a sharp look, the kind that files you away for later. He said he had no interest in upsetting established supply relationships for the sake of cheaper street food. I told him I was not cheaper. I was faster, more consistent, and already there. He told me his soldiers did not need fast food. They needed discipline. I told him his soldiers were buying my food anyway, at night, in groups of 10, because the official ration was short and everyone in the garrison knew it. That landed, not as an insult, as a fact he could not argue with, because he already knew it was true. He told me to leave the camp and not return without an appointment. I left, but I left the second sample box with the adjutant, and I watched the adjutant tuck it under his arm with the practiced ease of a man who had been quietly accepting things for a long time. The walk back to the syndicate's central kitchen took me through the garrison market, which was the strip of stalls and carts that had grown up along the outer wall to serve soldiers on leave and workers at the depot. 3 of those carts were ours now. Fox had moved them there 6 weeks ago without asking me, which was exactly the kind of decision I had hired her to make. The line at the nearest cart was already 12 people long before the second morning bell. I stood and watched for a while. Every third customer was in partial uniform, not on leave, just hungry before the official meal distribution, which ran 2 hours behind schedule most days. I pulled out my notebook and started writing numbers. The problem with Army food had nothing to do with quality. The Army's own cooks were not bad. The problem was the chain between the supplier and the soldier, and every broken link made the food worse. Too many hands, too many delays, too many points where something could go wrong or go missing, and nobody downstream had any incentive to fix it because the contract paid whether the food arrived hot or cold, fresh or spoiled. What I had built was the opposite of that. Every cart in the syndicate ran on the same prep schedule. Every burger was assembled the same way. Every bottle of cola was sealed the same morning it was delivered. The only variable was the customer, and the customer's only job was to show up and pay. The Army did not need a new supplier. It needed a system that worked the way mine worked. The question was how to make Vane see that before the autumn exercises fell apart. The answer arrived 2 days later in the form of a young captain named Eris, who showed up at our main cart just before closing with a worried face and a folded piece of paper. He was maybe 24, with the kind of lean jaw that comes from eating Army rations for years, and the kind of careful eyes that come from being smart enough to notice problems but junior enough that nobody listened to him yet. He unfolded the paper and put it on the cart counter. It was a supply manifest. The grain shipment for the autumn exercise provisioning had been delayed again, this time by a full week. The meat order had arrived, but a third of it had already turned. The contractor had logged it as delivered in full. Eris said he needed to feed 300 soldiers for 4 days, starting in 5 days, and he had roughly half the supplies he needed. He said he had heard we could move fast. I looked at the manifest for a long time. Then I told him to come inside. We sat at the back table in the prep kitchen, which smelled like rendered fat and caramelized onion, and I laid out what I could actually do. 300 soldiers, 4 days, field conditions. No fixed kitchen, no prep time on their end. Everything had to arrive ready to eat or ready to heat in under 10 minutes over a campfire. Eris said the general could not officially authorize this. He said if the general found out, there would be consequences. I told him the general would find out. The question was whether he found out before or after his soldiers ate. Eris sat with that for a moment. Then he asked what it would cost. I gave him a number that was fair, not cheap. Fair. I needed him to take it seriously, and people do not take cheap seriously when they are scared. He agreed on the spot, which told me he had already done the math and come to the same place I had. We shook hands across a prep table that still had flour on it. I called Fox in before he was out the door. The next 36 hours were the closest thing to a military operation the syndicate had ever run. Fox split the order into 4 daily runs, each one timed to arrive at the field camp before the morning drill and again before the evening rest. We pre-packed everything into wax-lined crates, burger stacks wrapped and labeled, cola bottles packed in sawdust to keep them from breaking, a flatbread and roasted onion option for soldiers who wanted something simpler. The delivery problem was the hard part. The field exercise site was 8 miles outside the city, past the river crossing, on a stretch of road that turned soft after rain. Wagons would be slow, wagons would be visible. Merrick had been working on something for 2 weeks that I had not yet used in the field. He called them carry frames, lightweight wooden structures that strapped to the saddle of a riding bird, one on each side, designed to hold 4 crates each. The birds were fast, narrow enough to move through the tree line beside the road, and quiet enough that a column of riders could reach the camp in under an hour without announcing themselves from a mile away. I had not planned to deploy them yet, but the plan had just changed. We loaded 6 birds before the first light of the exercise's opening day. I rode with the first group because I needed to see it work. The road was wet. The tree line was dark and smelled like pine resin and wet earth. The birds moved in a long single file, their wide feet barely making sound on the soft ground, the crates swaying slightly with each stride. We reached the camp perimeter just as the first drill bell rang. The camp was already in motion, soldiers pulling on gear, officers moving between rows of tents, the distant sound of someone shouting a formation order. The supply area was at the far end, and it was empty. No wagon, no morning ration. The official provisioning had not arrived. Eris was waiting at the tree line. He looked at the birds and the crates and said nothing for a moment. Then he said to follow him. We moved the crates into the supply area before most of the camp had noticed us. The syndicate runners I had brought with me, 4 of them, started unpacking and organizing with the efficiency that came from doing the same thing 200 times in the city. By the time the first company came off the morning drill, there was a full spread laid out. Hot burgers held in the wax wrap, cola bottles in rows, flat bread stacked on boards. The soldiers stopped, not because they were confused, because they were hungry and the food smelled real. The line formed in under 30 seconds. I stood back and watched. There was a moment, maybe 10 minutes in, when the noise of the camp changed. The low, tight sound of a tired and hungry unit doing its job out of obligation shifted into something looser. Voices got louder. Someone laughed. A group of 3 soldiers near the back of the line were already arguing about which cola was better, the standard or the double strength, with the intensity of men who had found something worth arguing about. One of them said the double strength was practically a war blessing in a bottle. Another said that was blasphemy, and also correct. The third said he had drunk 2 of them before the river crossing drill and had genuinely believed he could run through a wall. I wrote that down, not for the story, for the label. The general arrived 2 hours later. He came on horseback with 2 officers and no warning, which I suspected was intentional. He was the kind of man who liked to see things before they were arranged for him to see. He stopped at the edge of the supply area and looked at the crates, the runners, the soldiers eating in small groups with the relaxed posture of people who had been properly fed. Then he looked at me. I did not say anything. He dismounted slowly and walked over to where Eris was standing. They spoke quietly, and I watched every line of his face. I could not hear the words, but I could read the shape of the conversation. Eris explaining, Vane listening with his jaw set, and the 2 officers behind him exchanging a look. Vane walked over to the crate nearest to him and looked at the contents. He picked up one of the wrapped burgers, turned it over, put it back. He looked at the cola bottles lined up in their rows. He looked at the soldiers. Then he looked at me again. He asked how I had moved this much food 8 miles in under 2 hours. I told him about the carry frames and the birds. He asked how I kept the food hot. I told him about the wax wrap and the layered packing and the timing. He asked why the portions were all the same size. I told him because the same size means the same cost, the same prep time, and no arguments at the distribution point. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said his official provisioner had not arrived and was, based on the last report, still stuck at the river crossing with a broken axle. I told him I knew. He asked how I knew. I told him I had people on most of the major roads between the city and the exercise grounds because fast delivery only works if you know what the road is doing. Another silence. He said he did not like what I represented. I told him I understood that. He said the Army had systems, contracts, obligations to establish suppliers who had served the Crown for decades. I told him I knew, and that those systems had left 300 of his soldiers without breakfast this morning. He looked at me for a long time, then he turned to the senior officer behind him and told him to draw up a provisional field contract for the duration of the exercise period, to be reviewed for extension at the end of the month. The officer looked like he had been asked to do something slightly illegal. Vane told him it was not a request. The officer nodded and moved off toward the command tent. Vane turned back to me. He said this was a provisional arrangement. He said it did not represent an endorsement of my operation or a permanent relationship. He said if the food was late, inconsistent, or caused any problem among the troops, the contract would end the same day. I told him I understood every one of those conditions. He extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was exactly as hard as I expected. Behind him, the two officers were watching with the careful faces of men filing information away for later use. The senior quartermaster, who had arrived sometime in the last 20 minutes without my noticing, was standing at the edge of the supply area with the expression of a man watching his position erode in real time. I did not look at him for long. I did not need to. The contract was not large. 4 days, provisional, field conditions only. But it had Vane's name on it, and Vane's name meant something in this city that went beyond his rank. Fox appeared at my shoulder somewhere around midday, when the second delivery run had come and gone, and the exercise was running on schedule for the first time in what the soldiers said was 3 weeks. She looked at the camp. She looked at the birds resting in a line at the tree edge, crates already being reloaded for the evening run. She looked at the soldiers moving through afternoon drills with the kind of energy that comes from having eaten something real. She said the quartermaster's people had been asking around about our supply routes. I told her I knew. She said the guild liaison had sent a message asking for a meeting. I told her to tell him I was busy. She said a rider had come from the city while I was watching the morning distribution. The message was sealed with a mark she did not recognize. She handed it to me. The wax seal was small and precise. The mark pressed into it was a set of scales, slightly uneven, one side heavier than the other. I had seen that mark once before, on a document posted outside the Royal Commerce Hall. It was the personal seal of the king's senior advisor. I held the letter for a moment without opening it. Fox asked what it said. I told her I had not read it yet. She asked what I thought it said. I thought about the scales on the seal, one side heavier, the image of a balance that had already tipped. I told her I thought it said that someone in the palace had noticed that the army was eating well and had decided that whatever was feeding the army should belong to the crown. She was quiet. Then she said we were going to need a lawyer. I put the letter in my coat and watched the birds being loaded for the evening run, their wide feet steady on the wet ground, the crates strapped clean and even on both sides. The army marched on burgers now. The question was who the army would march for, and every person near that field was starting to understand it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because that was the day we ran the double batch for the Eastern Garrison, and Fox had just finished counting the morning float when the royal courier walked through the warehouse door like he owned the floor. He didn't knock. Crown men never knock. He placed the folder on my work table with both hands, the way you set down something heavy you want the other person to feel the weight of before they open it. I opened it. There were 43 pages inside. 43 pages of taxes, inspection schedules, licensing requirements, storage regulations, fire codes, sanitation clauses, and something on page 31 called a public commerce proximity levy, which I was fairly sure someone had invented last week specifically for us. Fox looked over my shoulder. She turned to page 4 and stopped. She said a word I won't repeat. The courier cleared his throat and told me the Royal Trade Advisor extended a generous offer. The syndicate, its routes, its contracts, its recipes, and its cold storage infrastructure would be transferred to Crown management. In exchange, I would receive a modest title, a pension, and the gratitude of the kingdom. I read that paragraph twice. Then I closed the folder, set it flat on the table, and told the courier I was grateful for the Crown's interest and would respond through proper legal channels within the allotted time. He looked at me like I had said something in a foreign language. I smiled and asked if he wanted something to eat before the road. He left without answering. Fox waited until his boots were gone from the doorway. Then she picked up the folder and started reading from the beginning, and the further she read, the quieter she got, which with Fox was always more frightening than noise. She said they weren't trying to steal from us. They were trying to drown us in paper until we surrendered. I told her she was right. She asked what we were going to do. I told her we were going to give them exactly what they wanted. Every tax, every license, every inspection, every form, every fee. Paid early, filed clean, stamped and returned before the deadline, with a copy kept for us. She stared at me. I told her that was only half of it. The real move was the structure. A single business sitting at the center of a network was one target. One lock to pick, one throat to grab, one signature to forge. But a web of separate owners, each holding their own license, their own property, their own legal standing. That was 40 different locks on 40 different doors in 40 different neighborhoods. Fox was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood. I told her to call everyone in. They came that evening. Fox, Merrick, the veteran, and the old man, the four people who had been with me long enough to know the difference between a problem and a threat. They sat around the table in the back of the warehouse with the smell of the evening batch still moving through the air, and I put a stack of documents in the middle of the table. The veteran looked at the stack. He asked if someone had died. I told him not yet. I told them what the Crown wanted and what I had decided to do about it. I told them the syndicate was going to become something different on paper, even if it stayed the same in practice. Each of them was going to own a piece, not work a piece. Own it. Marek asked what that meant exactly. I told him it meant the laboratory, the fermentation room, the recipe archive, and the supply contracts for the drink line would be registered in his name, his license, his property. He looked at the document I slid across the table. He didn't pick it up right away. I told the veteran that the packing line, the military ration contracts, and the garrison supply routes would be his name on the license, his signature on the Army paperwork. He looked at his one hand, then at the document. I told Fox she already knew what hers was: the logistics hub, the cart registry, the bird routes, the cold storage transfer schedules, every moving part of the delivery network, registered under her name, her mark, her authority. She didn't say anything. She just looked at the paper like it might disappear if she touched it. The old man asked what he was getting. I told him quality. Every batch that left any kitchen in the syndicate had to pass his nose before it moved. His certification stamp on every product. His word was the last word on whether something was good enough to carry our name. He was quiet for a long time, then he said his name hadn't been on anything official in 30 years. I told him it was about to be on everything. Nobody spoke for a moment. The evening batch popped and settled somewhere in the kitchen behind us. Then the veteran picked up his document. Marek picked up his. Fox folded hers carefully and put it inside her coat. The old man held his with both hands and didn't let go. I told them this wasn't charity, it was architecture. If anyone came to shut us down, they would have to shut down a licensed military supplier, a registered alchemical laboratory, a certified logistics operator, and a quality authority whose name was known in every market district in the city. They would have to explain to the garrison why their rations were suspended. They would have to explain to the Eastern merchants why their cold shipments stopped moving. They would have to do all of that publicly, on paper, with their names attached. The veteran said that sounded like we were making ourselves harder to kill. I told him that was exactly what we were doing. The next 2 weeks were the most boring and most important 2 weeks since I had arrived in this city. We hired a clerk, then 2 clerks, then a retired city registrar who knew every form, every office, every seal, and every obscure fee schedule in the municipal code. I paid him well and he earned every coin. We filed everything: licenses, tax declarations, sanitation certifications, fire safety inspections, storage permits, public commerce registrations, and the new proximity levy, which turned out to actually exist in a law from 40 years ago that nobody had enforced in 30. We paid it. We filed proof of payment. We kept the receipt. The clerks worked through the night twice. I worked with them. Fox ran the operations while I drowned in paperwork, which was the arrangement we had always had, just made official. On the 15th day, I opened the charitable kitchen. It wasn't a large space. A rented hall near the South Quarter, close to the labor yards where the day workers gathered before dawn. We ran 2 sittings a day, morning and midday, simple food, bread, broth, a portion of whatever was left from the batch runs, and a cup of the cheap grain drink that Marek had developed as a byproduct of the fermentation process. It wasn't charity in the way that word usually sounds. It was a statement written in food. The first morning, 30 people came: workers, dockmen, a few children, 2 old women who looked like they hadn't sat at a proper table in months. By the end of the first week, the number was over 200. I watched from the doorway one morning while the hall filled up. The servers moved fast and clean, the way I had trained every kitchen team to move. Nobody waited long, nobody left with an empty bowl. A city guard came in on the 3rd day, suspicious, looking for something wrong. He walked the hall twice. He checked the kitchen. He looked at our sanitation certificate on the wall. Then he sat down and ate. He came back the next morning with 2 colleagues. I didn't say anything about it. I just made sure there was always enough. The inspector arrived on a Thursday. He was a small man with a large coat and a leather case that he carried with the careful precision of someone who had spent his career opening it in front of people who were afraid of what was inside. He introduced himself as Senior Inspector of the Royal Commerce Office and announced that he was conducting a routine compliance review of the Syndicate of Street Provisions and all associated operating entities. I told him I was glad he had come and offered him a seat. He did not sit. He opened his case. He had his own copy of the 43-page document. He also had a checklist. It was long. He started with the main warehouse. He walked every aisle. He checked the cold storage seals, the temperature logs, the inventory manifests, the loading records. He checked the fire exits. He checked the pest control documentation. He checked the water source certification. Everything was there. Everything was clean. Everything was filed in the order it would need to be found. He moved to the kitchen. He checked the surface temperatures, the cleaning logs, the ingredient sourcing records, the staff certification documents. He asked to see the waste disposal records. I handed him a folder. He flipped through it without speaking. He moved to the logistics hub. Fox met him there with her own documentation case, which was, if anything, more organized than mine. She had cross-referenced the cart registry with the route logs and the delivery confirmations and the cold transfer records, all in one binder, tabbed and dated. The inspector looked at the binder. He looked at Fox. She looked back at him with the expression she used when she was waiting for someone to say something worth responding to. He moved on. He checked the laboratory. Merrick had laid out every recipe record, every ingredient source, every fermentation log, and every product certification on a long table in the order the inspector would need them. He had also, for reasons I still don't fully understand, arranged them by color of binding. The inspector stood in front of the table for a moment. Then he checked each item against his list. He found nothing wrong. He moved to the quality certification station. The old man was sitting at his usual bench with his hands folded and his head slightly tilted, the way he always sat when he was listening to something most people couldn't hear. The inspector asked how quality control was conducted without visual inspection. The old man asked the inspector to open the 3 sample jars on the table to his left. The inspector opened them. The old man identified each one by smell without being told the order, described the exact fermentation stage of the second jar, and noted that the third had been stored 2 degrees warmer than standard for approximately 6 hours at some point in the last 2 days. The inspector checked his notes. He looked at the jar. He wrote something down. Before he left, someone from the kitchen brought him a meal. It was not a bribe. It was the same meal we served to everyone who came through the door. He looked at it for a moment. He ate it. He didn't say it was good, but he finished everything on the plate and he ate slowly, which is the only review that actually means anything. He left with his case and his checklist and said the report would be filed within 10 days. I told him we looked forward to it. Fox came to find me 2 days after the inspector's report reached the trade advisor's office. She had a copy. She didn't explain how she got it. With Fox, there were things you learned not to ask. She read me the key section while I was checking the morning route sheets. The inspector had written that all operating entities of the syndicate were found to be in full compliance with current commerce law. Tax obligations were current and documented. Sanitation standards exceeded the municipal baseline. Storage facilities were certified and maintained. Staff documentation was complete. The charitable kitchen operated within legal parameters and served a documented social function in the South Labor District. He had written in the final paragraph that action against the syndicate would risk public disruption. We supplied the garrison, the eastern trade routes, the South Labor District, and a growing number of licensed vendors. He had recommended no action at this time. Fox lowered the paper. She said the trade advisor had apparently received the report in his private office that morning. I asked how she knew. She said the advisor's personal clerk had told the assistant registrar who handled our licensing paperwork, who had told her contact in the market district, who had told Fox. I asked what happened when the advisor read it. She said he had cleared his desk, physically, with his arm. I looked at the route sheets in my hand. I thought about a man in a fine coat standing in a fine office surrounded by papers on the floor, furious at a document that said everything was legal and clean and too useful to touch. This is how
Jin fights power. He does not punch the palace, and he does not beg the law to be kind. He makes the law expensive to use against him. Every license, kitchen, route, and public meal becomes armor. The advisor still has authority, but striking the syndicate now means striking the city that depends on it.
I told Fox that was the best news I had heard all week. She folded the copy and put it in her coat next to her franchise documents. Then she told me the grain reports from the eastern provinces had come in. The numbers were bad. Harvest yields down by nearly a third in 2 of the 3 main supply regions. The dry season had run long, and the rains had not arrived on schedule. She said the merchant houses were already adjusting their forward contracts. The guild warehouses were holding stock back from the open market. Prices in the daily stalls had moved up quietly over the last 10 days, the kind of slow, steady climb that doesn't cause panic until it suddenly does. I put the route sheets down. I asked her how long before it became visible to ordinary buyers. She said 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if the guild masters were careful about the pace. I stood there and thought about what 3 weeks meant. It meant the people in the charitable kitchen would start arriving hungrier. It meant the garrison supply contracts would get more expensive to fulfill. It meant every vendor in the city who bought ingredients at market price would start feeling the squeeze, and the ones without reserves would start failing. And it meant that whoever controlled stable food supply at scale, when the shortage became real and public, would be in a position that no title and no sword could match. I told Fox to get the team together. She asked what we were doing. I told her we were going to buy grain, not a week's worth, not a month's worth. Everything we could move into cold storage and dry storage before the price climbed past the point where the math still worked. She looked at me. I told her the drought was not a disaster, not for us. It was the next move, and we had to move before anyone else understood it. The heat had been building for 6 weeks before the first fight broke out on the market square. I heard it before I saw it. 2 men screaming over a sack of grain that had probably cost 3 times what it was worth a month ago, a guard watching. Not stopping it, just watching. Fox stood next to me with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. She said the grain merchants had been holding stock in their back warehouses since the 3rd week of no rain, waiting for the price to climb higher before they moved it. I looked at the square. Half the stalls were empty. The ones still open had guards standing in front of them with clubs, keeping the lines from becoming something worse. A woman near the bread stall was arguing with a vendor. She had 2 children behind her, both quiet in the way children get when they have learned that making noise costs energy they cannot spare. The vendor shrugged. He pointed at the price board. Ah. He did not look embarrassed. I had seen this before. Not in this world, but I had seen it. The logic of it was always the same. When supply tightens, the people with storage hold. The people without storage panic. The people in the middle get crushed. The guilds had storage. They had been building it for decades, protected by city law and guild charter and the kind of slow institutional rot that looks like tradition until it kills someone. The difference this time was that I also had storage. Fox said the Bakers Guild had announced a new price schedule that morning. Bread was up 40%, flour was up 60%. They were calling it a supply adjustment. I called it something else. She asked what I wanted to do. I told her to send runners to every syndicate point in the city. I wanted a count of every unit in cold storage, every barrel of preserved stock, every crate Merrick had sealed with his salt and acid process over the last 2 months. She said she already had the numbers. I told her to read them to me while we walked. We walked back through streets that felt tighter than usual. People moved differently in a food crisis. Shoulders up, eyes forward. The small courtesies that hold a city together start to fray when bellies are empty and the next meal is not certain. A group of dock workers passed us going the other direction. One of them recognized the syndicate mark on Fox's jacket. He asked if we were still open. I told him yes, same price as last week. He stopped walking. He looked at me like I had said something in a foreign language. I told him same price, same product, same hours. He turned to the man next to him and said something I could not hear. Then he nodded at me and kept moving. That was the moment I understood what the next few weeks were going to be about. It was not going to be about food. It was going to be about who people trusted when everything else became unreliable. The syndicate points opened that morning to lines that stretched around corners. I stood at the main distribution point near the east gate and watched the queue form. Workers, families, a group of apprentices from the tanner's district. 3 off-duty city guards in civilian clothes trying to look like they were just passing through. Fox had the team organized into stations. 1 person taking the order, 1 person pulling the set, 1 person at the handoff. No confusion, no delay. The line moved, but I could already see the problem forming at the edges. There were men near the back of the queue who were not there to eat. They were there to buy in bulk and resell at double the price 2 streets over. I had seen that move before too. I told Fox to put up the ration boards. She asked if I was sure. I told her if we sold without limits we would be empty in 4 days and then we would be the same as everyone else. She nodded once and sent the signal. The boards went up at every point at the same hour. 1 set per person, 1 additional set per household with children. No exceptions for bulk purchase. Any attempt to buy for resale would result in a permanent ban from every syndicate point in the city. The reaction was immediate, and it was not all gratitude. A man near the front of the line started shouting. He had coin. He wanted to buy 10 sets. He said I had no right to tell him what he could purchase with his own money. I walked over to him. I told him he was correct that he had coin. I told him the family behind him also had coin, and the family behind them, and the 50 people behind them, and if I sold him 10 sets, the family at the back of the line would get nothing. He said that was their problem. I told him it was actually mine, and I was solving it. He stared at me. I told him one set or nothing. His choice. The line was waiting. He took the one set and left without looking at me again. The woman behind him, the one with 2 children at her side, gave me a look I did not know how to categorize. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated, like she had not expected fairness and was not sure what to do with it now that she had seen it. The line kept moving. By midday, the other food vendors in the district had raised their prices again. By late afternoon, 2 of them had closed entirely. Not because they had run out of stock, because they had decided the risk of selling at a loss was worse than the risk of waiting. I watched one of them pull his shutters down and lock them. I told Fox to make a note of the address. She said she already had it. The closures started slowly and then all at once, the way these things always do. First it was the smaller independent stalls, then a tavern in the Weavers' district that had been running on thin margins for years, then a bakery near the south wall that had been in the same family for 3 generations. The owner was a heavyset woman named Dora, who had once told a city inspector that my burgers were a public health violation. She came to find me on the 3rd day of the crisis. She did not look like someone who had come to argue. She had the papers in her hand before she sat down. The deed to the bakery building, the equipment list, the remaining flour stock. She put them on the table between us and folded her hands and looked at the wall behind my head. I asked her what she wanted for it. She named a number. It was low. Lower than the building was worth even in a bad market. She knew it. I knew it. She was not negotiating. She was surviving. I looked at the papers. I told her I would pay her asking price for the building and the equipment. I told her I would also pay her 2 months of operating wages for every worker currently employed at the bakery, whether they came to work for the syndicate or not. She looked at me for the first time since she sat down. I told her if her people wanted to stay on and learn the syndicate's bread standards, there was work for them. If they did not, they left with enough to find something else. She asked why. I told her an empty building was just a cost. A building with experienced bakers already in it was an asset from day one. She was quiet for a moment. Then she signed the papers. That was the 4th acquisition that week. By the end of the week, it was 9. A tavern, 3 independent food stalls, 2 grain storage units whose owners had overspeculated and could not cover their debts. A butcher's shop near the Garrison district that had lost its army contract when the syndicate took over the military supply 6 months earlier. Each one became a node. Fox mapped them as they came in. She had a board in the back room of the central distribution point covered in chalk marks showing every syndicate location, every storage unit, every delivery route. She updated it every morning. I looked at it one evening and saw something that had not been visible 3 months ago. The syndicate now had more food infrastructure in the city than the Bakers Guild, the Butchers Guild, and the Innkeepers Guild combined. Not because I had been faster or smarter in any single moment. Because I had built cold storage when no one else thought it mattered. Because Merrick's preservation process meant our stock lasted longer. Because the ration system meant we were still selling when everyone else had either gouged their customers into anger or closed their doors to wait for better prices. The city had done the rest. Marek found me on the 6th day of the crisis looking genuinely happy for the first time since I had known him. He said the preservation batches were holding perfectly. He said the salt acid process he had refined over the last 4 months was performing better than his original estimates. He said he wanted to try applying it to a new category of vegetables that typically spoiled within days. I told him to do it. He said he would need 3 more assistants and a larger workspace. I told him to talk to Fox about the bakery on Copper Lane. The back room had a stone floor and good ventilation and was currently empty. He left at a pace that was almost a run. The Marek I had first found, sleeping in an alley behind the alchemist's quarter with a warrant for unlicensed experimentation on his belt, would not have moved like that. Something had changed in him since he joined the syndicate. He had stopped apologizing for knowing things. I understood that feeling. The comedy of the crisis, if you could call it that, was in the details. The Innkeepers Guild had spent 2 years calling our food cheap, unsafe, and beneath the dignity of a proper meal. They had filed 3 formal complaints with the city council about our methods. One of their senior members had publicly described a syndicate burger as, and I was told this verbatim, something a goat would refuse. By the 2nd week of the drought crisis, that same senior member was standing in the queue at our East Gate point, wearing a hood and a hat pulled low over his face. Fox spotted him on the 2nd day he came. She told me that evening with the specific kind of stillness she used when she was trying not to smile. I told her to make sure he got his one set like everyone else. No special treatment, no acknowledgement, just the food. She said she had already made sure of it. I told her good. She finally smiled. The guildmasters were meeting an emergency session by the end of the second week. I knew because two of the city council members who had been quietly accepting syndicate supply contracts for their district offices sent word through back channels that the guilds were preparing a formal petition to the city governor. The petition, as it was described to me, argued that the syndicate's ration system constituted an illegal restriction of trade and that our pricing during the crisis was artificially suppressive and designed to drive competitors out of business. I read the description of the petition twice. I told Fox that a guild which had spent 2 years restricting trade through charter protections and price-fixing agreements was now petitioning against trade restriction. I told her to write that down somewhere because I wanted to remember it. She wrote it down. The governor did not act on the petition. The governor was eating syndicate food 3 times a day through the supply contract his household steward had signed 4 months ago. His staff was eating it. His guards were eating it. His city was eating it. The petition sat on a desk somewhere and did not move. The day the Innkeepers Guild Hall came up for sale was a Tuesday. I remember because Fox brought me the notice in the morning before I had finished my first cup of water, and I made her read it back to me twice to make sure I had heard it correctly. The Guild Hall was a 4-story stone building in the Merchant Quarter, 3 blocks from the Central Market. It had a large ground floor, 2 upper floors of meeting rooms and offices, a basement with significant storage capacity, and a loading access on the side street. The guildmaster himself came to deliver the offer. He was a large man who had always carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had never needed to question whether he belonged in a room. He did not carry himself that way now. He sat across from me in the back room of the East Gate distribution point, which smelled of preserved meat and fresh bread and the faint chemical edge of Merrick's latest batch. He put the deed on the table. He said the guild could not service its debts. He said the emergency assessment from the city on the guild hall property had come in higher than expected. He said the guild's reserve fund had been depleted by the compensation paid to members who had lost income during the crisis. I let him finish. Then I asked him what price he had in mind. He named a number. It was the number of a man who had run out of other options. I looked at the deed. I looked at the floor plan he had brought with him. I looked at the basement storage dimensions. I told him I would take it. He blinked. I told him I would also honor the employment of the Guildhall's 3 permanent staff members at syndicate rates if they chose to stay on. He asked why I would do that. I told him the same thing I had told Dora. An empty building was a cost. A building that already worked was an investment. He signed the papers without saying anything else. He stood up. He looked around the back room of the distribution point one more time. Then he left. I sat with the deed in my hands for a moment. 2 years ago, the guild this building represented had filed complaints against me for selling food without a charter. They had lobbied the city to shut down my first cart. They had called me a health risk, a fraud, and a threat to legitimate trade. Now I owned their building. I told Fox to start the conversion plan, ground floor for expanded distribution, upper floors for syndicate administration and planning, basement for cold storage expansion. She was already drawing on her board. I told her to put the syndicate mark above the front door, not a small one. She said she would handle it personally. The crisis was not over. The drought was still running and the city was still tight and the rationing was still in place. But the shape of the city's food economy had changed in 2 weeks in a way that would take years to fully understand. The old structure had not been destroyed by the drought. The drought had only revealed how fragile it had always been. The guilds had built their power on restriction and tradition and the assumption that no one outside their system could compete. They had been right about that for a very long time. They had not been right about me. I was looking at the new map Fox had drawn when the runner came in from the Eastern Courier Post. The message was short. The kind of short that means the person writing it was moving fast and did not have time for anything extra. A border conflict that had been simmering for 3 months had broken into full engagement. 2 of the kingdom's eastern garrisons were under pressure. The Royal Army was mobilizing. I read it twice. Fox was watching me from across the room. I told her to pull the road maps, not the city maps, the kingdom maps. Every road between here and the eastern border, every waypoint, every river crossing, every town large enough to have a stable. She asked what I was looking for. I told her I was looking at how long it would take to move food from our cold storage to a garrison 200 miles east. She looked at the message in my hand. I told her the army was going to be hungry inside of 3 weeks. I told her the royal supply chain was going to fail the same way it always failed because it had been built on the same assumptions as the guilds, Tradition over function, hierarchy over speed. I told her we needed to be ready before anyone came to ask. She started pulling maps. I looked at the deed to the guild hall still sitting on the table. Then I looked at the runner's message. Then I looked at the map of the kingdom spreading out across the board as Fox pinned the corners down. The drought had given me the city. The war was going to give me something larger. I told Fox to start the stockpile calculations. She asked how much we were building toward. I told her to build toward feeding an army for a month. Not a week, a month. She looked at the map for a long moment. Then she picked up her chalk and started marking supply routes. The general came to find me at the warehouse, not the other way around. That told me everything before he opened his mouth. He walked past 3 dozen workers loading crates, past Fox calling numbers at the routing board, past Merrick arguing with a supplier about grain moisture content, and he stopped in front of me like a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say and still hated every word of it. He told me what happened in the throne room. He did not spare himself in the telling. The king had called an emergency council. Supply reports from the front had come in overnight, and they were not reports so much as confessions. Grain rotting in open wagons, salt pork that never arrived, quartermasters who had signed receipts for shipments that existed only on paper, 2 forward battalions running on half rations for 11 days. The general had walked into that throne room carrying a sack. He set it on the marble floor and opened it, and the smell reached the throne before the king could ask what it was. Rotten barley. Black at the center, soft at the edges, the kind of grain that turns a man's stomach into a battlefield of its own. He said the king went very still. The advisor went pale and started talking about emergency procurement and alternative suppliers and a committee to investigate the quartermasters, which was the kind of answer that sounded like a plan and contained nothing useful at all. The general told him to stop. He said the army had 2 weeks before the front collapsed. Not a month, not 6 weeks. 2 weeks, if the rot had spread as far as his scouts were reporting. I did not see any of that, but the general described it so precisely, so slowly, that I could feel the weight of the sack hitting marble. He had swallowed his pride to stand in front of me in a warehouse that smelled like rendered fat and chalk dust. That cost him something real. I respected it. I asked him what the advisor said when someone finally suggested calling me. The general almost smiled. He said the advisor had suggested it himself, which was the most expensive thing that man had ever done, because he would spend the rest of his career pretending he had not. I told the general I needed 4 hours to finish the routing board update. He said he had a royal summons in his coat pocket and the king expected me that afternoon. I told him the king could wait 4 hours or he could wait 2 weeks for a different reason. The general looked at me for a long moment. Then he sat down on a crate, crossed his arms, and waited. That was the second thing that told me everything I needed to know. Fox handed me the finished supply map at the 3rd hour. Marek had the pork preservation numbers ready. The veteran who managed our bird routes had the flight capacity chart rolled and tied. I put on the same work coat I wore every day, the one with chalk marks on the left sleeve and a burn scar on the right cuff from a brazier accident in month 2. I did not change. The general raised an eyebrow. I told him the coat was clean enough and the maps were accurate. That was what mattered today. We rode to the palace. I had passed the outer gate once before, delivering a catering order for a minor court function that a junior steward had quietly arranged without telling his superiors where the food was coming from. That time, I used the servants' entrance around the back, near the kitchen yard. This time, the front gate opened. The guards did not ask my name. The general was beside me, and the summons existed, and apparently that was sufficient. The entrance hall was enormous and cold and full of people dressed in fabric that cost more than my first month of revenue. They looked at me the way people look at something that has appeared in the wrong room. I looked at them the way I look at a market that does not yet understand it has a problem. A lord near the left column actually stepped back. Not dramatically. Just a small half-step, the kind a person takes when they are not sure whether something is dangerous or merely wrong. I was carrying a rolled map under each arm, a leather folder of ration calculations, and a smaller tube containing the bird route capacity charts. No sword, no title, no family crest on anything. Just paper, numbers, and the knowledge that every kitchen in this building ran on flour and salt that moved through my warehouses. I kept walking. The doors to the throne room were tall enough to make a person feel small by design. Old trick. Architecture as intimidation. It stopped working on me somewhere around the time I signed my 3rd army supply contract and realized that the people behind those doors needed me more than I needed the doors. They opened anyway. The throne room was exactly what I expected and nothing I had prepared for emotionally. The king was older than the portrait suggested. He sat forward in his chair, not back, which meant he was paying attention rather than performing authority. That was useful. A king who performs is harder to work with than a king who listens. The advisor stood to the left, dressed impeccably, expression arranged into something that was almost neutral but not quite. There was a tightness around his jaw that he had not managed to relax. The general took his position to the right. I walked to the center of the room and stopped at the table that had been set up there. Someone had anticipated that I might bring documents. That was either the general's doing or someone in the palace had been paying closer attention to how I operated than I realized. I unrolled the first map. It covered the table completely. Supply lines, warehouse positions, road grades, bridge weight limits, bird relay stations, farm output zones, projected spoilage rates by season and transit time. The king leaned forward another inch. The advisor's jaw tightened further. I did not wait for permission to speak. I told them the army's supply problem was not a corruption problem, though corruption had made it worse. It was a structural problem. The quartermasters were working a system that had been designed for a different kind of war, slower, shorter, with shorter supply lines and smaller armies. The system had not changed. The war had. I told them I could fix it. The king asked what I wanted. I had expected him to ask what I needed, which is a softer question. He asked what I wanted, which meant he already understood this was a negotiation. I told him I wanted authority over every supply road between the capital and the front. Not advisory authority, not consultative authority, operational authority. My people, my routing decisions, my inspection rights at every depot and way station. I told him I wanted the right to requisition transport, wagons, horses, birds, river barges. If it moved goods and the army needed those goods moved, I needed to be able to direct it. I told him I wanted a guarantee, in writing, that no lord, no guild, and no court official could override my supply decisions during the campaign without a direct order from the king himself. The advisor made a sound that was not quite a word. I looked at him. I told him the alternative was that he could find another supplier who could move preserved protein rations, cold-stored vegetables, and standardized field packs to 3 forward positions in under 6 days. I told him I would wait while he identified that supplier. The room was quiet. The king looked at the map for a long moment. Then he asked the general if the 2-week estimate was accurate. The general said it was conservative. It might be less. The king looked back at me. He asked if I could actually deliver what I was describing. I told him I had been delivering it to his army for 4 months already. The only difference was that now I needed the authority to do it at full scale without lords taxing my wagons at their borders and guild inspectors delaying my shipments at city gates. The king picked up the edge of the map and looked at the route lines running east toward the front. He asked how long before the first supply run reached the forward battalions. I told him 72 hours from the moment I left this room. He set the map down. He told the advisor to prepare the authority documents. The advisor opened his mouth. The king told him again, more quietly, which was worse. The advisor closed his mouth and nodded. I rolled the map back up. I told the king I would need the documents before I left the building, because I intended to begin routing assignments within the hour. He almost smiled. It was a very small expression, the kind a man makes when he recognizes something he was not expecting to respect. The room shifted around that small expression. The documents took 40 minutes. I used the time to brief the general on the first 3 priority routes, mark the critical bridge that needed weight reinforcement before the heavy wagons could cross, and send a runner to Fox with a message that contained one word: begin. She already knew what it meant. We had built the activation plan 3 weeks ago, during the drought. When I told her to prepare for something larger than the city, she had asked how much larger. I had told her to prepare for the whole country. She had not argued. She had started drawing routes. The authority documents arrived on palace letterhead, sealed with the royal mark, signed by the king and countersigned by the general. The advisor's signature was also there, small and precise and written with the controlled pressure of a man who understood exactly what he was signing and hated that he had no choice. I folded the documents into the leather folder with the ration calculations. I thanked the king for his time. He told me to feed his army. I told him that was what I did. I walked back through the throne room, through the entrance hall, past the lords in their expensive fabric, through the front gate, and into the street. Fox was already at the routing board when I got back. Merrick had the preservation pack staged in the loading yard, 42 crates of dense field rations from month 6. They were tested for transit, heat, and tired soldiers unloading wagons in the dark. The bird route master had 6 birds fed, watered, and ready in the dispatch yard. 3 of my best route managers were standing at the board with chalk in their hands. I unrolled the map on the routing table and put my finger on the forward position that the general had flagged as most critical. I told them the first run needed to leave within the hour. Nobody asked if I was serious. They started moving. The next 6 hours were not a triumph. They were work. The loud, physical, grinding kind of work that does not look impressive from the outside but is the only thing that actually matters. Wagons loaded, routes assigned, weight limits checked against the bridge report, bird manifests filed, depot contacts messaged through the relay system we had built during the franchise expansion. Fox moved between the routing board and the dispatch table without stopping, marking completed assignments in green chalk and flagging problems in red. There were problems. A depot manager at the Eastern Way Station had been taking a percentage from every shipment that passed through his post, skimming it into a private arrangement with a local merchant. He had been doing it for 2 years and had gotten comfortable. He was not comfortable anymore. My inspector arrived at his depot with the Royal Authority document and a very specific inventory list and the instruction to count every sack in the building and compare it to the official records. The numbers did not match. The depot manager was removed from his position before nightfall. His replacement was a woman who had been running one of our franchise supply points in the southern quarter for 8 months. She knew our systems, she knew our standards. She had never once signed a receipt for a shipment she had not personally verified. She was on a bird to the Eastern Way Station before the sun went down. Merrick came to find me at the 3rd hour of the night, when the loading yard had finally quieted to a steady rhythm instead of controlled chaos. He handed me a cup of something hot and asked how I was holding up. I told him I was fine. He told me I looked like a man who had been awake for 20 hours and was running on the memory of sleep. I told him that was accurate and drank the cup. He asked if the king understood what he had actually agreed to. I thought about that for a moment. I told Merrick that the king was smarter than the advisor wanted him to be. He understood that he had handed operational control of his country's supply chain to a former street cart operator with a debt history and no title. He had done it anyway, because the alternative was losing a war. Marek said that sounded like the beginning of something that would be very difficult to undo. I told him that was the point. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked about the pork preservation formula for the high-altitude forward positions because the temperature variance at elevation was affecting the salt cure rate, and he wanted to adjust the concentration before the next batch. I told him to increase the salt ratio by 8 parts per hundred and add the smoked fat layer we had tested in month 5. He made a note and went back to his table. The first supply convoy reached the forward position at dawn on the 3rd day. The report came back by bird 6 hours later. The officer commanding that position had written 2 lines. The first line said the rations were good. The second line said his men had not eaten a proper meal in 9 days, and 3 of them had cried when the food arrived, which he was including in the report because he felt it was relevant operational information. I read that report twice. Then I put it in the folder with the Royal Authority documents and the ration calculations and the route maps. Fox asked what it said. I told her it said the system was working. She looked at my face. She said it looked like it said something else too. I told her to mark the eastern route green and start planning the second convoy. She picked up her chalk. The advisor sent a message that afternoon through a junior courier, carefully worded, suggesting that the Emergency Supply Authority was a temporary measure and that the court would naturally wish to reassess the arrangement once the immediate crisis had passed. I wrote back on a single sheet of paper. I told him I looked forward to that conversation. I told him to let me know when the army no longer needed to eat. I did not hear back. The war was not over. The front was stabilized, not won. There were months of work ahead, convoys and depots and preservation problems and route adjustments, and the thousand small decisions that keep a supply chain from collapsing under its own weight. But the first convoy had arrived. The soldiers had eaten. And everyone in that palace now knew, in a way that could not be undone by a committee or a document or a carefully worded reassessment, that the food came from me. Fox was already marking the second convoy route in green. I told her to add a 3rd line, running parallel to the main road, using the river barges for the heavy grain loads. She marked it without looking up. The system was moving, and the people who had built it were the ones the old world had thrown away, which made the victory feel sharper. The work did not stop. It just changed scale. Months later, 3 days after the last wartime supply convoy rolled back through the eastern gate, I was sitting in the syndicate's main counting room with cold tea and ledgers I had already read twice. Fox walked in without knocking. She had stopped knocking about 6 months ago. She dropped a folded document on the table without a word and sat across from me, arms crossed, watching my face. I unfolded it. It was a draft. Not a final decree, not an official seal, just a draft, written in the careful hand of someone who expected it to become real very soon. The language was polite, which made it worse. Polite language in official documents is how powerful people say things they would never say to your face. The draft proposed a transfer, All emergency food infrastructure, all cold storage routes, all distribution licenses granted under wartime authority returned to direct crown management within 30 days. The reason given was gratitude. The kingdom was grateful for the syndicate's service and wished to relieve it of the burden. I read that line 3 times. Relieve it of the burden. I set the paper down and picked up my tea. Still cold. There were 7 names at the bottom of the draft. Not signatures. Just names written in a margin note, as if someone had been keeping a list of who agreed in principle before the ink was even dry. I recognized 4 of them immediately. 2 guild lords who had tried to bankrupt me during the drought. 1 treasury minister who had sent inspectors to my warehouses 4 times in a single season, and Lord Fenwick, who had called me a gutter rat in open court and apparently saw no reason to revise his opinion just because the gutter rat had fed his army for 2 years. The other 3 names I did not recognize yet. I wrote them down anyway. Fox was still watching me. I asked her how she got it. She said she had a friend in the palace copying room. Then she said the word friend the way she always said it when she meant something slightly more complicated than friendship. I told her I was glad she had friends. She almost smiled. I looked at the list of names again. 7 men who had just watched the syndicate hold the kingdom's eastern flank together through a war and had decided the correct response was to take everything back before the gratitude became permanent. They were not stupid. That was the frustrating part. They understood exactly what had happened. They understood that I now controlled more of the kingdom's actual daily function than any single institution except the crown itself. They understood that if nothing changed, that situation would only grow more stable and more permanent over time until it became impossible to reverse. So they were moving fast, while the war was still fresh, while people were tired, while the king was in the mood to sign things that returned the world to something familiar. I did not blame them for trying. I had been waiting for exactly this move since the first army contract. The question was never whether they would try to take it back. The question was always how to make the attempt teach them something they could not unlearn. I folded the draft carefully and put it in my coat. Then I asked Fox to call a full team meeting for that evening. She asked if I was going to do something that would give her gray hair. I told her I was going to do something very simple. I was going to show everyone in this city exactly what the syndicate actually did, without hiding any of it, for exactly 1 day. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she went to call the meeting. The team gathered in the main warehouse that evening. Fox, Merrick, the veteran, the old man, and about 40 other people who had been with the syndicate long enough to know when something serious was being planned. I spread a city map on the central table and put small markers on every route, every warehouse, every distribution point, every contracted delivery. Then I sorted the markers into 2 groups. The first group was every route that served the working districts, the hospitals, the barracks, the orphan houses, the market stalls in the lower city, and the civilian bread lines we had been running since the drought. The second group was every route that served the palace kitchens, the guild halls, the noble estates, the luxury markets in the upper city, and the private contracted deliveries to the households of the 7 names on my list. I told the team that tomorrow, the first group would receive full service. Every delivery, every ration, every order, on time, same as always. The second group would receive nothing, not because we were punishing anyone, not because we were making a political statement. Simply because we had a temporary staffing shortage and needed to prioritize essential services during the transition period. I used those exact words. Temporary staffing shortage, transition period. Marek started laughing before I finished the sentence. The veteran looked at the map for a moment, then nodded once, which was his version of enthusiastic agreement. The old man said nothing. He just turned his head slightly toward me, the way he did when he was listening to something he found interesting, and said the city was going to smell very different tomorrow afternoon. He was right about that. The next morning, the lower city woke up to the usual routine, carts on the usual streets, smoke from the usual cooking stations, the smell of fresh bread from the distribution points near the eastern gate. The barracks received their morning delivery at the usual hour. The duty sergeant signed for it without looking up, which meant everything was normal. The hospital on Copper Lane received its full weekly supply before the sun was fully up. The orphan house on the hill, the one that Fox had personally taken over managing 2 years ago, received double rations because I had told the driver to add the surplus from a canceled noble order. The lower city did not notice anything unusual. That was the point. The upper city noticed by mid-morning. The palace kitchen sent a runner to the distribution depot at the second hour. The runner was told there was a temporary staffing issue, and deliveries to that route were delayed. The runner went back. Then a second runner came, this one with a note from the head of palace household management. The depot supervisor, a young woman named Tessa who had been with the syndicate for 3 years and had the calm patience of someone who had handled much worse, told the second runner the same thing. Temporary issue. They were working on it. Estimated resolution tomorrow morning. The second runner went back. By the fourth hour, 3 guild halls had sent their own runners and received the same answer. By midday, Lord Fenwick's estate had sent a carriage, not a runner, a full carriage with a household steward inside who seemed genuinely confused about why his standing weekly order had not arrived. Tessa offered him tea and told him the same thing she had told everyone else. The steward left without the tea. Fox was moving through the city all morning, not doing anything, just watching. She came back at midday with a look on her face that I had learned to read as controlled satisfaction. She told me the upper market was already showing gaps on the luxury stalls. The vendors who supplied the guild halls and noble houses were running low because their own resupply deliveries had not arrived. The chain was short and they had not built reserves because they had never needed to. I asked about the palace. She said the palace had reserves for about 2 more days of normal operation. After that, they would be improvising. I asked about the lower city. She said the lower city was fine. She said it with a small pause before the word fine, the kind of pause that meant she was slightly surprised by how fine it actually was. That pause was the thing I had been building toward for 2 years. The lower city was fine because the syndicate had spent 2 years making sure the lower city would never be the first place to feel any disruption. Every reserve, every backup route, every emergency supply cache had been positioned to protect the people who had the least ability to absorb a shock. The upper city had no reserves because it had never needed them. Someone had always just delivered things. By late afternoon, I received a message from the palace. Not a runner this time. A sealed letter with the royal mark, delivered by a guard in formal dress. The king would receive me at the 3rd hour tomorrow morning. I wrote back that I was honored by the invitation and would attend. Then I went to find Merrick. He was in the back of the warehouse, surrounded by his usual collection of bottles, burners, and notes written in handwriting that only he could read. He had been working on a new preservation method for the field ration packs, something that would extend shelf life by another 2 weeks without changing the taste. I told him I needed him to bring the full ledger set to the palace meeting tomorrow, not a summary, the full set. He asked which ledgers. I told him all of them. Every supply chain record, every delivery log, every cost sheet, every contract, every staffing record, every maintenance schedule for every cold storage facility in the city. He looked at me over the top of his work. He asked if I was planning to bury the king in paper. I told him I was planning to show the king exactly what he was proposing to manage. Marek was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would need a cart. I told him to get 2. The throne hall in the morning light looked exactly the way it always looked. High ceilings, stone floors, the kind of architecture designed to make the person standing in the middle of it feel small. I had been in this room before. The feeling had worn off. The king was already seated when I arrived. Advisor Krell stood to his right, holding a folder, wearing the expression of a man who had spent the previous evening rehearsing for a conversation he expected to control. I bowed correctly and waited. The king looked at me for a moment. He was not a bad man. I had come to understand that over the past 2 years, he was a man who had inherited a system and had never had a reason to question whether the system was the best possible version of itself. He said the kingdom owed me a debt for my service during the crisis. I thanked him. He said it was therefore appropriate to now return things to their natural order. I said I understood completely. Then I asked if he would permit me to leave the ledgers with him for review before he signed the transfer order, simply so that the transition could be managed smoothly. Krell said that was not necessary. The Crown's own administrators would handle the transition. I looked at Krell. I kept my voice very polite. I said I had no doubt about that. I simply wanted to make sure the administrators had complete information. Transitions of this complexity sometimes had details that were easy to miss. I gestured to the door. 2 of my people came in with the first cart of ledgers, then the second cart. The king watched them come in. Krell watched them come in. The guards watched them come in. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I began to explain, not lecturing, just walking through it, the way I would explain something to a new hire on their first day. The cold storage network required daily maintenance schedules. If the maintenance was missed by more than 48 hours in summer temperatures, spoilage began in the 3rd-tier warehouses first. The loss rate was documented in Volume 7 of the supply logs. The delivery routes to the eastern barracks used a relay system through 4 transfer points. If any one transfer point was understaffed, the entire eastern route slowed by 6 hours. The staffing requirements were in the personnel files, cross-referenced with the route maps in Volume 12. The field ration contracts with the Army required monthly quality verification. The verification protocol had been developed by my head of laboratory over 18 months of testing. The protocol itself was 40 pages. It was in volume 19. The grain reserve rotation system worked on a 90-day cycle. If the cycle was interrupted, the oldest reserves began to degrade before the new intake arrived. The timing was critical and the schedule was in volume 8. I kept going. Krell stopped me at some point and said this seemed unnecessarily complicated. I agreed with him completely. It was genuinely complicated. That was why I had been working on it for 3 years. The king had been looking at the carts of ledgers. He had not said anything for a while. I told him I was not trying to be difficult. I was trying to make sure the transition succeeded. The people of this city depended on this system working correctly every day. I would be glad to spend as much time as needed helping the Crown's administrators understand every part of it. I said that last part looking at Krell. Krell looked at the carts. The king asked how long it would take to train the Crown's people to manage the system independently. I thought about it for a moment. I told him honestly, to train people who already understood logistics and supply management, probably 2 years. To train people starting from the beginning, probably 5. The room was quiet. I waited. The king looked at the carts again, then he looked at me. Then he said something I had not expected him to say quite this quickly. He asked what I wanted. I reached into my coat and took out the document I had been carrying for 3 days. It was not the draft decree that Fox had brought me. It was something I had written myself, in the same careful official language, over 2 evenings in the counting room. I called it a charter, the Great Provision Charter. The name was deliberately plain, no grand language, no claims of power, no titles. It said 3 things. First, the syndicate's infrastructure would be recognized as essential public infrastructure, with the same legal protections as roads and bridges. Second, the syndicate would operate under a permanent license with fixed terms, reviewed every 10 years, with clear performance standards that it had to meet to keep the license. Third, in exchange, the syndicate would guarantee minimum provision levels to every district in the city, including the lower city, the hospitals, the barracks, and the orphan houses, regardless of market conditions. I handed it to the king. He read it. Krell read it over his shoulder. I watched Krell's face while he read. He was looking for the trap. He was certain there was a trap. He read it twice, looking for it. The trap was that there was no trap. The charter gave the Crown exactly what it actually needed, a guarantee that the system would keep working with clear rules and accountability. It gave the syndicate exactly what it needed, legal permanence and protection from exactly the kind of draft decree that had started this whole conversation. It did not make me a lord. It did not give me a title. It did not give me a seat on any council. It just made the syndicate permanent. Krell said the Crown could not cede authority over essential infrastructure to a private entity. I pointed to the second clause. The license was granted by the Crown. The Crown could revoke it if the performance standards were not met. The authority remained with the Crown. The operation remained with the syndicate. Krell looked at the clause. He looked at the carts. He did not say anything else. The king asked for 3 days to review the charter with his advisors. I said, of course. I also said that during those 3 days, I would restore full delivery service to all routes, including the palace and the guild halls, effective immediately. The staffing shortage had been resolved. The king looked at me for a moment. He did not ask about the staffing shortage. He understood what it had been. He nodded once. I bowed and left. Outside the palace gates, Fox was waiting. She had been there since I went in, sitting on a low wall, eating one of the syndicate's standard breakfast packs like she had nowhere else to be. She asked how it went. I told her we would know in 3 days. She handed me a breakfast pack. I had not eaten since the previous evening. I sat down next to her on the wall and ate. The city was moving around us the way it always did in the morning. Carts, smoke, voices, the smell of bread from the distribution point 2 streets over. It did not look like a city where anything significant had just happened. It looked like a city having breakfast. That was the thing I had understood from the very beginning, from the first morning in that alley with a broken cart and a debt I could not pay. Power that looks like power is always visible. People can see it, fear it, resent it, and eventually find a way to push back against it. Power that looks like breakfast is different. Nobody fights the thing that feeds them. Not permanently, not when the alternative is visible and immediate and empty. 3 days later, the king signed the charter. Krell witnessed it with the expression of a man watching something he had tried very hard to prevent and had failed to stop. This is the final form of the whole story. Jin never needed a crown because a crown only commands what people can afford to ignore. Food is different, roads are different, storage is different. When soldiers, workers, clerks, and even nobles begin their day inside your system,
The throne becomes your largest customer.
The 7 names from the draft decree were not in the room. I had made sure of that, not by excluding them, but by scheduling the signing for an hour that conflicted with a guild meeting that all 7 of them attended every week. They would hear about it afterward. That was fine. I did not need them to see it happen. I just needed it to happen. The king handed me the signed document. He held it for a moment before releasing it. He said something that surprised me. He said he hoped I understood that what I had built was bigger than a food business. I told him I had understood that for a while. He asked if it concerned me. I thought about the alley, the broken cart, the debt, the cough that woke me before my eyes opened. I told him honestly that what concerned me was whether the system kept working, whether the hospitals got their supplies, whether the barracks had hot food before a march, whether the orphan house on the hill had enough for the week. He looked at me for a moment. Then he let go of the document. I walked out of the palace with the Great Provision Charter in my coat, Fox 2 steps behind me, the city making its usual morning noise around us. The syndicate was now infrastructure, same as roads, same as bridges. You could argue with a merchant, you could tax a guild, you could buy out a competitor. You could not dismantle a bridge while people were standing on it. I had not taken the throne. I had not wanted the throne. The throne was a seat in a room where people argued about power. I had built something different. Something that ran whether or not anyone in that room agreed with it, because the city needed it to run, every morning, before the arguments started. Fox fell into step beside me as we reached the main street. She said the veteran had sent a message. The morning line at the Eastern Barracks had been 240 soldiers, and they had cleared it in 18 minutes, which was a new record. I told her to pass along that was good work. She said Merrick wanted to show me the new preservation test results when I had time. I told her after lunch. She said the old man had asked if we were done with the hard part now. I thought about that for a moment. I told her to tell him the hard part was keeping it running. She nodded like she had expected that answer. We walked back through the city together, past the morning carts and the open stalls and the distribution point where a line of workers was already moving through in the quick, practiced way that meant the staff knew their job and did not need to be told twice. The work did not stop. It never had. It just kept feeding people, one morning at a time. And that was the only kind of power I had ever actually wanted.
Jin's real weapon was never the burger. It was the way he saw value where everyone else saw waste. Bad meat became profit. Forgotten people became managers. A broken cart became infrastructure. And a king became just another customer. That is the value of this story. If you control what people need every day, you do not have to chase power. Power starts coming to you. Thanks for watching. Like the video, subscribe for more stories like this, and comment what you would have built first in this world.